Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock episode 395. This is of course the Patreon Drydock as it's the last Sunday of March and well, therefore there's going to be a lot of questions, so let's get started with them. Jeffrey Connolly asks, did China ever design or build armoured cruisers? If so, what were their names and could you give a brief bit about their history? China, strictly speaking, didn't lay down or design its own armoured cruisers because at the time the armoured cruisers were in vogue, the Chinese shipbuilding industry was in no way, shape or form capable of doing so. They did technically possess a couple of armoured cruisers, albeit that the term is really being stretched at this point. So the two ships in question were built in Germany, as was a good chunk of the Chinese fleet at this time period in the late 19th century. And they are called the Lai Yuan and the Jing Yuan. And if you're one of the 6 people who've managed to get through the Great Firewall of China and I mispronounced those, apologies. Or if you happen to speak Chinese and you're not in China, let me know how well I did. Unhelpfully, the latter one, Jing Yuan, shares a name, at least in English, with a protected cruiser built at around the same time. Although, if you look at the Chinese characters that make up the name, although they both translate to Jing Yuan in English, there's one character is very slightly different, which in full spec English translation has very slight differences in accent. I don't know what the difference between the two is, but there you go. In any case, the reason I say these things are technically armed cruisers, but it really is stretching the definition, is as you can probably tell from the men standing on the bridge there and the guys standing in front of the gun up front, these are not large ships. An armoured cruiser is traditionally held to be a pretty large vessel, somewhere between the protected cruiser and the battleship, and in some cases perhaps physically larger because of, at least in length, because they need speed. These two ships didn't even break 3,000 tons. The only reason that they count as armoured cruisers is because, well, at the time they're just about large enough to be cruisers, albeit, again, even then it's stretching things a little bit, but they do have a fairly thick belt, over 9 inches of belt armour, so they are cruisers with belt armour, and that makes them, by the definition of the time, an armoured cruiser. Their main armament, as you can see up front, is a pair of 8.3-inch guns, so just forward-mounted main armament. There's a couple of 5.9-inch guns, as you can see, one on each side in a casemate, and 4 torpedo tubes and some machine guns, so not particularly heavily armed. And as far as active service careers go, it wasn't particularly long. They were laid down in the mid-1880s. They entered service with the Imperial Chinese Navy, specifically the Beiyang Fleet, in the late 1880s, and they were around for about half a decade before the Sino-Japanese War 1890s edition broke out. And they were both at the Battle of Yalu River, which you'll know didn't end particularly well for the Japanese Navy. Lai Yuan actually survived. She took on the Japanese gunboat Akagi, which was a mere 600 tons or so, and it was in kind of a mutual kill. Neither ship actually sank, but Akagi was quite heavily damaged, but in turn, her rapid-fire 4.7-inch guns actually knocked Lai Yuan out of the battle, and she had to go off for repairs. She was then subsequently sunk at the Battle of Weihai Wei, whereas her sister, Jing Yuan, was just straight up shot up very badly by the Japanese at Yalu River and rolled over, sank and exploded. Greg M. asks, how did the British Navy's thinking about what makes a good admiral change between the Napoleonic Wars and the start of World War I? For example, if Nelson had been born around 1870 to 1880, how might he have fared in the early 20th century British Navy? Well, Britain's thinking on what made a good admiral changed many times between the Napoleonic Wars and the start of World War I, but a lot of it, if you want to look at a general trend, and this was something Admiral Fisher identified in the 1900s, had essentially been mitigated from the Nelsonian style quite a bit by 2 major things. Firstly, of course, kind of a victim of its own success, the Royal Navy was big enough and powerful enough that nobody had seriously challenged it since the Napoleonic Wars. The Royal Navy had been at war, technically speaking, places like Crimea and so forth, but broadly speaking, when the Royal Navy showed up, it showed up with such overwhelming firepower that either, if there was a battle, it was a pretty one-sided cakewalk, or the enemy just gave up before even trying to fight, like the Russians did in the Crimean War. They just sank their fleet rather than face off against, at that point, the combined might of the Royal Navy and the Marine Nationale. And yes, there had been a few smaller conflicts here and there, but they were pretty short and didn't bring anything like the full might of the Royal Navy to bear. As a result, without the fires of war to point out, the kind of traits that you need in a warfighting admiral, as generally happens with a lot of navies when they go unchallenged in direct peer conflict for a long time, you ended up with the establishment, if you like, becoming more and more conservative. So risk takers, people who didn't obey orders, people who thought outside the box, the kind of people you need to fight a war, gradually became more and more discouraged. So admirals who thought that way generally weren't given command, or admirals who tried to pull things back in that direction, like Tryon, generally became viewed as mavericks rather than the standard. The ability to do staff work ashore kind of became, in a lot of ways, more of a factor in a naval officer's advance than necessarily what they actually accomplished with command at sea, because if no one's really challenging you, then your command at sea theoretically should be nothing really changed as far as the establishment is concerned, which of course doesn't really help show off your capabilities. So, for example, even in World War I, Admiral Sturdy was initially regarded as not a particularly capable flag officer. And to be fair, he wasn't a particularly good flag officer to have at home at the Admiralty, plotting tactics and strategy at a distance and trying to manage all the admin. What he was a very effective and very forward-thinking officer in combat, frontline officer. Almost the direct inverse of Beatty, who was pretty much as useful as a chocolate teapot when it came to actually leading any significant formation of ships into battle. But if you put him behind the lines where he could work his political connections and deal with grand strategy, he wasn't half bad. And indeed, things had gone to quite the absurd degree. So if you say, well, Nelson's born around 1870, 1880, well, as Fisher pointed out when he started to conduct reforms to the Royal Navy officer recruitment path, a Nelson who was coming of age in the late 1800s, so 1890s, early 1900s, would not have been admitted into the Royal Navy, because by that point the requirements for entry into Dartmouth had been so ossified that you needed to be of a certain social class. There were exams and so forth you had to pass as well, which is fine, but you actually needed to be of a certain social class, and you needed to be able to afford some fairly exorbitant fees. Just the fee to actually go to Dartmouth per year was roughly the equivalent of the average working man's total annual salary, or wages, depending on obviously if salaried or just generally working. But anyway, and even if you were of a upper middle class background, that still represented about a quarter of your total yearly income. So really only the absolute upper middle class and the aristocracy could afford to send their sons to Dartmouth, and, well, Nelson wasn't from that background. So even if he'd been able to finagle his way in by, my grandfather or great-grandfather was of the appropriate social class, he still wouldn't have been able to afford it. Fisher changed that. So there's the kind of, if you like, the peacetime drawdown on the kind of officers and standards that you need to fight a war, which, as I said, is generally a problem with a lot of different navies over time. But the other big issue was that back in the Napoleonic Wars, although the Royal Navy dominated the seas, in terms of who it was up against multiple peer opponents who, on paper at least, frequently outnumbered the Royal Navy, if you put all the, say, Franco-Spanish fleet together. And therefore, the Royal Navy, both in the Napoleonic Wars and before that, was fighting for its very existence. It was in a knockdown, drag-out fight with its enemies. And for that, you need people who are going to take risks in a lot of cases, because if you play it safe, you will lose. Whereas by the time of World War I, of course, again, because Britain had gone unchallenged, in part because of its industrial potential, Britain had dominance of the seas from the start. It had by far the largest navy. It had by far the largest naval industry. It already had the position that people like Nelson were fighting to achieve on the global stage. And at that point, if you're not fighting to attain the position, but rather you're fighting to defend the position, then suddenly being a conservative admiral who just doesn't lose becomes a lot more attractive to the establishment than being an aggressive admiral who might win the day in spectacular glory, but might also lose horribly. I mean, to put it in a land-based context, for example, if you're besieging a castle or a fortification or some kind of defended position, the kind of officer that you want to attack that position and take it, and what their qualities are going to be, is very different from the kind of qualities that you'd want in an officer who's assigned to defend that position. Now, obviously, a good officer should be able to do both, but ultimately there will be officers who are exceptionally good at defending and retaining a position, and other officers who are very good at attacking and taking a position. And the latter is the kind of officer that Nelson was, the kind of officer that the Royal Navy had come to value by the end of the Napoleonic Wars. The former is what the Royal Navy valued once it was sitting on top of the pile already. Alex Moskowitz asks, how did World War I and World War II ships deal with ice buildup when sailing in cold climates? Did the ships need to slow or stop to get rid of ice, and did the ice cause any stability concerns? Did they need to remove ice while in battle? In World War I, for the most part, ships dealt with ice in cold climates by just not being there, because there wasn't any particular reason to be there most of the time. For ships that couldn't avoid that, like, say, when the Russians were building their Vanguard class, they would take actual measures when constructing the ships. So, although not designed to be icebreakers, the Vanguards did have strengthened bows to help them deal with the occasional bit of ice. And when you look at the Vanguards compared to contemporary battleships, you'll also notice that above the main deck, they have extremely little in terms of superstructure. There's the gun turrets, there's a very small bridge, some masts, and that's really about it. And part of that was Russian design style, but part of it was also because if you minimize the superstructure weight up top, you also minimize the amount of ice that can build up on said superstructure, and thus you minimize stability issues. Once you go into World War II, you have a lot more ships heading up north. Obviously, the Germans have occupied Norway, there's Arctic convoys and so forth, and suddenly ice becomes a lot more of a problem. Ships generally tended not to run at absolute full speed in those environments, partly because, well, the Arctic seas are not usually particularly nice to sail in, and even in the occasional calm periods, obviously if you have floating sea ice, it's better to be going a little bit slower so that you can see and avoid said sea ice in advance rather than replicating the Titanic. But in terms of stability concerns, yes, ice buildup could be a major stability problem, and clearing that ice would be part of the crew's duty on a regular basis. Now, obviously, when the seas were a little bit calmer, this could just be done while the ship was moving on, and there would be no particular need to slow or stop to help get rid of the ice. But if they were in particularly rough weather, which obviously would cause a lot of spray, and if it's very cold, that would actually cause ice to build up quite quickly. And of course, rough weather means your margin of stability is even more important than usual. Then in those circumstances, if you did get a critical buildup of ice, then a ship might have to slow down somewhat. Not stop, because stopping in the middle of World War II just to deal with ice is pretty much suicidal, but you might well slow down enough so that, say, the crew can get out on the bow and chip away significant chunks of ice without being constantly washed away by water coming green over the bow. And in terms of removing ice while in battle, generally no, because, as I said, removing the ice would be an ongoing process. Once battle starts, no one should be out on deck for many, many obvious reasons. And once the big guns start firing, well, that tends to self-clear the guns and the turret of ice anyway, and the blast effects of the guns as they traverse and fire at different targets tends to do a pretty good job of clearing large sections of the upper works of the ship of ice at the same time. Plus, assuming that ongoing maintenance has been done and the ship is, relatively speaking, not in critical danger of rolling over at the start of a fight, the amount of time that any kind of naval engagement lasts in the Arctic convoy period, it's just not long enough for ice buildup to gather to such a degree that it threatens the ship's survivability. Again, assuming that proper maintenance has been done in advance. Michael Gilson asks, after seeing Kimmel leave for the continental United States, Nimitz wrote in his diary, "There but for the grace of God go I, or any other admiral unfortunate enough to be in command at Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. Considering how clear-sighted Nimitz was, I'm inclined to believe him, but maybe the same clear sight could have saved him. What, if anything, would Nimitz have done differently than Kimmel if he'd accepted the command, and would it have been enough to keep his career from ending on December 7th, 1941? It's a little bit difficult to unpick because, of course, both what we know about Pearl Harbor and the opportunities there were to, if not necessarily prevent, at least mitigate the attack, are all influenced by hindsight, as is our evaluation of Nimitz, because, of course, Nimitz evolves as an officer both in his tactics and strategy and his understanding of his fleet's capabilities as the war goes on. So the Nimitz of 1945 is a very different admiral to the Nimitz of December 7th, 1941, in terms of what he may or may not do. Now, with all that said, there are admittedly, within the realms of plausibility, some fairly limited opportunities to actually rescue the situation at Pearl Harbor, or say, at least mitigate it. The single biggest one, outside of the tactical stuff, because when you look at tactical stuff, should that radar station have said, hey, there's a massive contact heading towards us, and it looks a lot bigger than a flight of B-17s, by that point, the fundamental issues had long been, missed. So while that might have slightly changed things, it would have changed things hugely. The overall problem was that there wasn't a joint command with a single overall point of leadership. You had General Short and Admiral Kimmel. Theoretically, neither of them was superior to the other, and I'm not saying they didn't get along very well, but their command staffs certainly didn't seem to see much of a reason to actually talk to each other. And that, I think, is probably where Nimitz, if he was going to be able to change anything to a point he might save his career if he was in charge on December 7th, that might be where he would be able to change things. Because although, again, there still isn't going to be a superior commander, one or the other, I think Nimitz probably would or could have been significantly more aggressive about making sure that, at the very least, the Army and Navy commands talked to each other and liaised with each other a lot more considerably. And so, for example, when the Army was preparing mostly for internal fifth column actions, but Nimitz knows that, hey, from the Navy decrypts, hey, the Japanese fleet's gone missing, he might then turn around to Short and say, well, you know what? We don't actually know where the Japanese fleet is at the moment. It's unlikely, but they could come here. So maybe we should prepare the anti-aircraft defenses and so forth a bit more, because, of course, the AA defenses, fighters on land-based airfields, etc., that's all under the Army at this point. And likewise, I think Nimitz might keep his fleet a little bit more on edge, maybe a few more drills, maybe not quite so relaxed on December 7th. But even if they were somewhat relaxed, it was a Sunday after all, I think with that initial integration and the higher degree of readiness, generally speaking, there would have been perhaps a bit more edge to the respective command staffs and the officers underneath them. So while they might not be on a full warning, they might be on a sort of, well, for now we don't know where the Japanese fleet is, so let's just keep a bit more of an eye out, let's be a bit more suspicious. And that, as a cascade of actions, might then lead to one or more of the initial tells, like the little midget sub being shot up by the Ward or the big radar return coming in, being questioned a lot more closely and a lot more quickly, at which point the fleet goes on alert. And then when the Japanese attack shows up, I don't think there's anything Nimitz is really going to do to prevent the attack, but when the attack does occur, you're going to probably have a lot more army anti-aircraft guns ready. The ships will be closed up in action stations with their anti-aircraft guns ready, and who knows, there might even be several flights of US AAF fighters out and about to disrupt the attack. Now, will that save Nimitz's career? I think at that point it's going to depend entirely on just how much damage the fleet takes. Because if the fleet takes substantial damage, somebody is going to have to carry the can, and Nimitz would be the senior-most officer on site. Whereas if the attack is seen to be absolutely massive, but it's a surprise attack that's managed to be driven off with perhaps damage to some of the Pacific Fleet battleships, but none of them sunk catastrophically, then that might well be enough to keep his career on track as the admiral who foiled the dastardly Japanese air attack. Elite Corsair asks, if the Wasp had survived her submarine attack, how would she have compared to forthcoming US light carriers? And in your opinion, how would the US have used her in the latter part of the war? Also, would it have been plausible to build Wasp functionally as a bare minimum Yorktown class to be rapidly refitted at the outbreak of war, but still meet the lower pre-war tonnage threshold? So the second bit first, I don't think it's possible to build a kind of skeletonized Yorktown on the displacement that the US Navy decided to do for Wasp, because the Yorktowns are just substantially larger vessels, and there's not a huge amount that you can lose. I mean, if you look at the Yorktown class and you think, okay, well, we've got to lose about 5,000 tons to bring us in under the displacement limit, roughly speaking. That's 25% of your total standard displacement. So, what can you lose? You can lose every single inch of armor. That's only going to be a few hundred tons. You could lose catapults. You could lose every single gun. Still, okay, it's several hundred more tons, so you might be just about breaking 1,000 tons saved at this point. You could build the ship and only install half the machinery, so you'd be going slower, but I mean, that would save a fair amount. It's still not going to be anywhere near 5,000 tons cumulative total. And you'd have the problem of you'd have to leave some pretty big access hatches to be able to drop that machinery into place as and when you're going to war. It would be a pretty obvious tell, because people would be going, this hull is one very, very, very large for something that's claiming to be, 14,000, 15,000 ton standard. Also, if you remove somehow 25% of your weight, it's going to be riding ridiculously high in the water. In terms of her comparison, though, to the Independence class, she's in some ways similar, in some ways somewhat superior. So I have a feeling that as the war went on, she would she would still be used on the front line if she'd survived, but she would be probably used as a kind of a giant Independence class, viewed as a giant carrier, mostly on account of her relative lack of protection. So she has a much longer flight deck than the Independence class. She's a fraction slower, but not enough to make a huge difference, I think. Similar range, but has a significantly heavier anti-aircraft armament. And obviously that would expand as the war went on, and a significantly larger air group. So, compared to the Independence, roughly 3 dozen, Wasp would easily be carrying 2.5 times as many aircraft. So you'd be in the weird position of having a carrier that theoretically has almost as much strike potential in terms of aircraft carried as any other major fleet carrier, but is a little bit smaller, is a little bit slower, and is considerably more vulnerable. So when you see the various US task groups in the latter part of the war, where you have Enterprise, Saratoga, and the various Essex class as kind of your fleet carrier elements of those individual forces, and then they'll have one or two independences with them. I think Wasp would essentially sit in occupying a slot where an independence would be. So perhaps for the flagship formation, you might have, let's say, two Essexes, Wasp, and an independence. Or in another formation, because of her much greater air group, you might have two Essexes and Wasp. Or they might put Saratoga, Enterprise, and Wasp in a single group, and that allows them to have purely Essexes and independences in all the others. Brian Smith asks, how common was it for navies to reuse class names like the Royal Navy did during World War I and World War II with the King George V town and county classes? It's relatively uncommon, but it does happen at times. And that's partly a factor of, in order to end up reusing entire class names, you tend to have a navy that's building an awful lot of ships. So you actually cycle back round to similar names or identical names again. And also, it's a lot to do with why a ship is named the way it is, and what your Navy's conventions are for naming a class. So, obviously, if you have a very small Navy, you probably just aren't going to cycle back through the names again, so it's impossible to get a second class by the same name. And then you have examples where you have different classes with the same name, but of different types of ship. So, for example, the US has the Pennsylvania and the Tennessee classes. Now, they're present as both armoured cruisers in the 1900s, and then, the next decade, there's the Pennsylvania and the Tennessee class battleships. Similarly, the Japanese have the Congo-class ironclads, and then later on they have the Congo-class battle cruisers. Or the Germans, they have the Scharnhorst-class armoured cruisers, and then they have the Scharnhorst-class battleships. But you will occasionally also get class names reused within the same kind of ship. So, for example, the US Navy, which is why I've chosen this picture, has the New Orleans-class cruisers in the 1800s, and then, of course, they have the New Orleans-class cruisers in the 1930s as well. The Germans actually have three sets of Königsberg-class cruisers, a pre-World War I class, a World War I class, and an interwar class. But if you're going to get recurring names, there's also the possibility, as I said, of how does your Navy name ship classes? So, for example, in the Royal Navy, generally speaking, if it's named after a ship rather than a concept, then it'll be the first ship of that class that's laid down. And if it's a tie-break, because more than one ship of that class was laid down on the same day, then it'll go to commission date. But there are exceptions to every rule. So, for example, the Revenge class is generally called the Revenge class, but Revenge was not the first ship of the class to be laid down. But she was the first to be commissioned. But that's why you'll see the R class, as they're sometimes known, often referred to by almost any of the names within the class as, Ramillies class, Resolution class, Royal Sovereign class, etc. The US Navy, on the other hand, generally speaking, goes by hull number, so within a class, whichever ship has the lowest hull number gives its name to the class, regardless of whether or not it's the first ship to be laid down or not. Although, again, there are exceptions to every rule, so in the US case, you initially have the Astoria class, but USS Astoria is the first ship of the class to be laid down, but is not the lowest hull number. The lowest hull number is USS New Orleans, CA-32, and eventually will become the New Orleans class, but really only after Astoria herself is sunk. Whereas if the US Navy went by the first ship in the class to be laid down rather than hull number, then the Illinois class would become the Alabama class, the Virginia class would become the Rhode Island class, the Connecticut class would become the Louisiana class, etc., etc. For the three classes you name specifically, it does get a little bit murky because, for example, you have the World War I town class and you have the World War II town class, but although, as a shorthand, both of them are referred to as town classes in pretty much all references, the fact is that each of those classes is made up of a number of subclasses, and at the time, you do have direct reference to them being referred to by ship name classes, like say, Southampton class or Weymouths. And similarly for the counties, you'll sometimes see them referred to as kents rather than counties in period literature. And then as you go further back, you get confusing things like the Monmouth class, which theoretically should be a county class, but is usually referred to as the Monmouth class. And then you have the King George V's, and they have their own individual story, which I've recounted a couple of times on different dry docks, but quickly here. There was a long-standing tradition in the Royal Navy that the first capital ship, so initially a first-rate ship of the line, but later on obviously a dreadnought battleship or pre-dreadnought, the first capital ship built in the reign of a new monarch should carry the name of that monarch. So that's why you get various Royal Georges, Royal Annes, etc. in the Age of Sail Royal Navy, Royal James, Royal Charles as well. Then, of course, there's a little bit of confusion because Queen Victoria is around for so long, you actually have multiple ships called Victoria, or some variation thereof, throughout her reign. Then you have the King Edward VII class. And spoiler alert, that's because King Edward VII took over. Then you have the King George V class, because it coincides with the reign of King George V. But then when you fast forward, what we now know as the World War II King George V class should have been the King Edward VIII class, because they were being considered when King Edward VIII was on the throne for the extremely short time that he was on the throne. But by the time the ships were actually under construction, he had abdicated, aka been kicked out, and King George VI was on the throne. But there was still a fair bit of ill feeling running around concerning the whole situation. So although in theory he could have gone, well, the King Edward VIII is no longer around, therefore these are now the King George VI class, and then they're now named after me, rather than do that and, effectively in some ways being seen as stealing his brother's battleship, he decided, actually, we do have to rename it because no one likes Edward VIII much at this point in the general populace, so we're instead going to name it after our father. But obviously they're both sons of the previous monarch, so you get the reversion back to King George V class. And that's why what theoretically should have been a set of Admiral class battleships minus the King's ship become King George V, because reversion, Prince of Wales, which is kind of a nod to King Edward VIII without actually calling it King Edward VIII, Duke of York, which was the title of King George VI before he became king, and then you have the remnants of the admiral names in Anson and Howe at the very end of the class run. And then, of course, you get onto the reign of Queen Elizabeth II, where there was a bit of a debate over what counted as a capital ship now, and as a result, during her entire reign, we actually didn't get a ship named Queen Elizabeth II. We do have Queen Elizabeth, the aircraft carrier, but it's technically Queen Elizabeth, not Queen Elizabeth II, so it actually refers back to, well, the battleship HMS Queen Elizabeth and Queen Elizabeth I, strictly by naming convention. But then they apparently seem to have decided that the true capital ship is the ballistic missile submarine, but they didn't name either of the two ballistic missile submarine classes built during Queen Elizabeth II's reign after her, but one of the new Dreadnought class ballistic missile submarines is going to be named King George VI, continuing the, albeit one monarch long, named after the previous monarch situation, which means that if we build another set of ballistic missile submarines at some point in the next few years, although that's not particularly likely, then one of those theoretically should be Queen Elizabeth II, and so on and onwards we go. Adney and Becky ask, are there any battles that you find especially sad or emotionally moving? They say, personally, they find the battles of Coronel and the Falklands in World War I sad, as in both cases, one side, the losing side, knew that they were almost certainly doomed, and both admirals in both cases essentially decided to sacrifice their fleet rather than abandon their slower vessels. Now, obviously, this is the kind of question that's going to be very specific to each individual person's, emotional triggers, but I think, for me, battles, whether they be small 1v1s or major ones, that I find, if you want to say sad or emotionally moving in terms of sadness or adjacent feelings, as opposed to, wow, that was really cool and awesome, which is, I think, a completely different category of battles, then I think for me it would be ones where either the people in question were so close to achieving something and had put a huge amount of effort and work into it, and it was snatched away from them at the last minute by luck or happenstance, or perhaps by things completely outside of their control, because, well, as Captain Picard said, sometimes you can do everything right and still lose. Or the other one would be something that's just extremely long and drawn out, where for whatever reason there's some kind of connection that you feel to them. And you don't necessarily have to have had a relative on that ship, but for how people form connections is, of course, a whole other psychological subject. But for example, in one of the episodes of the US Navy submarine campaign in the Pacific, which is a series I need to get back to later this year, you'll notice that pretty much the last 5-7 minutes of one of those episodes is just a continuously running bit of footage of USS Wahoo as she comes in to dock for, as it turns out, the final time before she heads out on her fateful mission. And for some reason, when I saw that bit of footage, knowing obviously what's about to happen to them a few weeks down the line, that actually struck me as quite moving, because we know from the limited reports around her sinking that it wasn't the case, like a lot of submarine sinkings, of, the submarine is detected, the submarine is attacked, depth charges go off, submarine is destroyed. Obviously, there are plenty of long pursuits of submarines as well. But we know in particular with Wahoo's case that she was almost certainly attacked for a very prolonged period of time. She was making an absolute run for it. And similar to what I mentioned earlier, there are circumstances where a very small change in what happened could have allowed her to get away. But in the end, she didn't, and she was eventually sunk with all hands. And it's that kind of so close but yet so far element, combined with the fact that, having then seen that footage and looking at them going, these are people who we know in hindsight are not long for this world. They have absolutely no idea. And that just kind of established a little bit of a connection in my brain somewhere that made that footage all the more poignant. Whereas, perhaps if it's a submarine being hunted down in the middle of the Atlantic, aside from the escorts just giving up and going away, then once it's locked down, there's never really much of a chance except by sheer luck for it. Whereas in Wahoo's case, you can see, like, if that hadn't happened, or if that particular thing hadn't happened, there was a sort of safety just about within reach, but as it turned out, just out of their grasp. Ian Carr asks, can you comment on World War II senior officers serving at sea? Some, like Vian and Somerville, seem to spend most of the war at sea, while others, such as Harwood, Lyster, Whitworth, etc., who, despite early successes, were removed to other than obvious frontline roles and desk jobs for extended periods. There's a very mixed bag when it comes to this. Ultimately, there is the fact that there are a limited number of major at-sea commands for someone on the scale of an admiral, even in a time of war. And therefore, when you're talking about, the Eastern Fleet or the Mediterranean Fleet or the Home Fleet, if an admiral is doing a fairly decent job and seems to be up to the task of continuing with that job, in wartime, it's a very bad idea to just pull them offline and replace them unless either they show signs of cracking under the strain or they write back and say, hey, look, I can't do this for much longer. And so if you have someone like, say, Vian, who essentially exists to attack everything in sight, he's just going to keep throwing himself at the enemy until somebody reels him in. So in wartime, great, keep going, essentially. Plus, you have admirals who, they may well have success at sea for various reasons, but their best skills might lie elsewhere, perhaps in some kind of admin. And obviously war does generally speaking, force a form of extreme meritocracy. So if you have perhaps an up-and-coming rear admiral or vice admiral who's a rank below who seems to be exceptionally good at sea operations, and this other admiral who, yes, he's succeeded in early operations, but from his history, you know that actually he's also pretty darn good at some form of admin or training, etc., then you may very well go, well, actually, you have had success at sea, but we need you at home more than we need you at sea. And so they end up back at home. They may also have some kind of screw-up in their career that postdates their success. They might just tick off the wrong senior officer. That's still a thing even in the middle of war to a certain degree, although you really, really have to tick off a lot of senior officers in wartime to get transferred ashore without, again, majorly messing up. And you can also end up with circumstances that go perhaps a little bit less seen if you just look at their list of postings, which can be things like health. And so if an officer might be very successful, might genuinely want to continue fighting, but if their health just isn't going to allow that, either their own self-reported health or medical officers going, this guy will probably die if we keep him in a highly stressful combat command for the next 6 months, then they're going to be brought back ashore where their talents can still be put to use without, actively killing them. And while obviously with the great downsizing of the Royal Navy in the post-war environment, there is a big swathe of retirements amongst the flag officers, you see someone like Vian is perfectly happy to just keep going in his role, whereas basically everyone else you listed in the other set, Harwood, Lyster, Whitworth, they're all retiring basically either in 1945 or very early in 1946, despite the fact that age-wise at least, they theoretically could continue to serve on, but it's quite clear that in a number of those cases, their health just is no longer there to allow them to serve in those senior positions. And so they end up taking retirement at a similar time to some much more senior officers like Admiral Cunningham. And in actual fact, Admiral Cunningham actually outlives a good number of those people, which also gives you some idea of, again, just how much health could play a factor. The Weeaboo Terminator asks, are there enough differences between the Fargo-class light cruiser and the preceding Cleveland class to consider them separate classes, or is the Fargo class more akin to a subclass of the Cleveland class? I'd say it's dancing right on the edge, but I think there are enough changes with the Fargos to make them a separate class. So here you can see I've taken two side-on profiles, one of the Cleveland class, one of the Fargo class, grayed out pretty much everything except for the main armament and the upper superstructure. And I think when you look at them side by side, you can see there are quite a lot of differences. So, for example, the 5-inch battery on either side has been lowered on the Cleveland class, which is at the top, by the way. You can see that the 5-inch battery is on little pedestals. On the Fargos, it's been dropped. Similarly, the 5-inch guns on the center line have been dropped down. So actually, although it's harder to spot with these diagrams, but you can probably maybe just about see it, the main armament has dropped slightly. And then you look at the superstructure. On the Clevelands, you've got two small funnels. The Fargos, you've got one large funnel. The Clevelands have a bigger forward superstructure with the bridge, etc., and it's right up behind the 5-inch 38 twin mount forward. On the Fargos, that's set considerably further back and reduced in size. The Clevelands also have quite a substantial aft superstructure behind the second funnel. The aft superstructure on the Fargos is much, much reduced. You've also got other details like, for example, the Cleveland superstructure extends in a little pedestal around to support the forward 5-inch 38, whereas on the Fargos that's been extended so it actually integrates with the superfiring 6-inch turret. And the same thing aft. With the Clevelands, the superstructure ends with the pedestal that's supporting the aft amidships centerline 5-inch 38, whereas again on the Fargos it extends all the way back to the superfiring aft 6.6-inch turret. So although they are, as you can see, pretty much almost identical hulls with the same 12 6-inch guns and the same number of 5-inch 38s, the sheer number of changes in both the precise positioning of the main and secondary armament and that massive redesign of the superstructure, I think makes them visually distinct enough that you can say they are two separate classes. Chris Knight asks, on US destroyers, could the Mark 15 have its gyro angles and depths set in the tube like the Mark 14s in submarines? And if so, was this updated automatically by a torpedo data computer? Qualified, yes, in that the system installed on destroyers was able to set the gyro angle and speed of a torpedo, and it was able to continuously automatically update that by electronic transmission from the system to the torpedoes in the tubes. However, there are a couple of major differences between the torpedo data computer found on US submarines and the torpedo director found on most World War II US destroyers, the most typical one being the Mark 27 torpedo director. So having gone through the manuals for both, the significant differences are that the Mark 27 has separate settings for the fore and aft launchers, assuming we're looking at, say, Fletcher classes ones, because obviously that does make a difference because these launchers are positioned at different portions of the ship, whereas thanks to the fixed nature of the torpedoes in a submarine, even if you have aft tubes, you can kind of treat the forward tubes as having a fixed launch point, the aft tubes as having a fixed launch point, whereas on a Fletcher class, for example, you might have both sets of tubes firing at the same target on almost the same bearings, but because they are spaced somewhat along the ship, they do need to be aimed very slightly differently. And of course, you might want to launch only some of the tubes, so you set up a heading for them, or you might want to launch one set of tubes at one target, one set of tubes at another target. On top of that, it doesn't seem, at least from the manual, that the Mark 27 has a depth setting. It has inputs and outputs for target speed and target bearing, your own speed and your own bearing, and of course the position of the torpedo launchers on what gyro angle you might need to, if you're going to launch the torpedoes at that moment. But there doesn't seem to be a specific setting on the Mark 27 to change the depth of the torpedoes, presumably because the theory goes that the enemy is on the surface, you're on the surface, and therefore the torpedo can run at a fixed depth, and that should be fine. The other thing is the Mark 27 seems to lack the ability of the TDC to dial backwards and forwards in time and present different solutions. It's kind of a very much, this is what your solution is at the moment, which again makes sense because with destroyers, you're going to aim your torpedoes, and if you're aiming your torpedoes, there's a pretty decent chance you're going to be firing them pretty soon. So you don't necessarily need to know what's going to theoretically be the case 5 minutes in advance, especially because in a surface action where torpedoes are being flung around, there's a good chance, well, the enemy's going to change their course and speed in 5-10 minutes time. Whereas in a submarine where you're stalking a ship that probably doesn't know that you're there and you're just plugging along, then obviously the ability to accelerate time and say, well, this is where everything should be in X amount of time, and then check that with a periscope is far more useful. Dr. D.M. Platt asks, how did the US Navy's APA and AKA compare with the Royal Navy's landing ship infantry and related vessels? So, for those of you unfamiliar with the shorthand, the APAs are attack transports, what we might recognise as amphibious assault ships, and the AKAs are attack cargo ships, essentially a similar concept except for transporting cargo rather than men. So here, for example, is APA 33 USS Bayfield, and as you can see, in some ways she very closely resembles a cargo vessel with a bunch of landing craft on her deck because, well, that's essentially what she is. Now, the differences between the two broad families, the British and the Americans, are, generally speaking, that with a couple of small group exceptions, the British vessels were taken up from trade. So they're a variety of ships, usually passenger ships and some mixed-use ships and a couple of cargo ships as well. And they're just taken up and turned into LSIs, landing ship infantry, and then they have different bracketed letters after them. So an LSI-L is a large, LSI-M is a medium, and you get the idea as things go on. And thus, since you're talking about a whole bunch of different ships, a whole bunch of different sizes, and they're almost all conversions, except for a few that were taken from the US as Lend-Lease, the British vessels have wildly differing capabilities and, generally speaking, carry slightly fewer people, whereas the US Navy's APA and AKA ships, generally speaking, were built as part of class runs, usually based on C2, C3, etc. hulls. So they had a standard design to work from initially, occasionally purpose designed as well. And as a result, being somewhat more purpose designed, they could carry more people. And of course, they were a lot more regular. If you saw one APA, chances were there are a couple of dozen at least similar vessels in the US fleet, a number of which might be a few hundred yards away from that first one. Whereas for the British ships, it would be a case of, if you were lucky, there may be 3 or 4 ships that were roughly similar, like the Glen series, which were a series of merchant vessels being constructed in the Royal Navy. Just went, nope, they're ours now. And a lot of the British ships actually had multiple careers, starting off as regular transport ships or armed merchant cruisers, and then being turned into landing ships once the need started to become more apparent. Armament-wise, they're actually relatively similar between the US and the UK ships. They'd have a few heavy anti-aircraft guns, obviously 5-inch for the US, usually 4-inch for the British, and then a smattering of 20mm Oerlikons and some pom-poms or Bofors as well on the larger ones. There's a slight tendency, at least in ships of roughly comparable dimensions, for the British ships to have slightly more of the heavy guns, so they might have 4 or 6 4-inch guns, whereas a lot of the US ones would have a couple of 5-inch guns. But commensurately, the US ships generally would have slightly higher barrel counts for light and medium anti-aircraft guns. But overall, I would say that the US set was somewhat superior, essentially just based on the fact that there was distinct commonality between them, which made interoperability much easier. Although there were some small ones, generally speaking, most of the US ships were on the large side. So if they were in Royal Navy service, they'd be classified as LSILs, whereas quite a lot of Royal Navy ships, when it came to the landing ships, were on the medium to small side of things. And because, again, of the purpose-built design, they could just carry more people. The one place I would say the Royal Navy did have a small advantage was that while the vast majority of APAs, AKAs, and LSIs had a speed of roughly 17 to 18 knots, there was the occasional example where the Royal Navy took usually actually some what you generally look at as medium-sized ships in this category, but which had significantly better performance, so speeds in the low 20s of knots, and actually then turned them into fairly heavily armed, for converted merchant vessel, commando carriers. And they were then able to use these in, relatively speaking, high-speed raids on places like occupied islands off of Norway and indeed on the Norwegian coast, and so on and so forth. So if you wanted a slightly higher speed attack landing vessel to transport commandos into enemy territory, then the Royal Navy did have some better choices than the US did. But if your main job is, we want to transport large numbers of infantry from point A to point B and then put them down in a whole bunch of little attack boats to go to the beaches, the US Navy is your best bet. 54 asks, if the Americans had Lake Michigan on which to train carrier pilots completely out of reach of the enemy, and the Germans had the relative safety of the Baltic in which to train U-boat crews and work up newly built ships, were there similar safe rear areas used in this way by other powers, and how big of a strategic impact can access to them, or lack thereof, have? Yes, to a certain degree, every major power that was involved in the conflict for a significant amount of time did have some safe-ish areas to operate in. So for the Italians, for example, the northern end of the Adriatic, and to a limited degree the northern end of the Western Mediterranean, kind of off Genoa and La Spezia, etc., was relatively safe. The Adriatic obviously somewhat more so, simply by dint of being at the top end of Italy, and you had to get past the rest of Italy to get there. The Japanese obviously had the Sea of Japan and the Inland Sea, and those were pretty safe, well, right up until they weren't. In the Sea of Japan's case, there were occasional US submarine intrusions. By the middle of World War II, and the inland sea gradually obviously became less and less safe as the war continued to go on from there. For the British, it was a little bit harder because, of course, once France fell, the Channel definitely was off limits, the North Sea was an active war zone, the Arctic was an active war zone, and the Atlantic was an active war zone. And German coastal submarines did tend to range as quite a bit along the UK's coastlines. However, the Irish Sea, to a limited degree, and the western coast of Scotland, to a greater degree, were relatively safe areas. In part because, well, with the Irish Sea, it was much easier to close off the entrances to it with patrols and so forth. And, of course, if you're a German coastal sub, if you are going after British shipping, it's much easier to go after the North Sea coast or the Channel coast than risk going past those coasts anyway to get all the way around and then be attacked at the kind of the tail end of your endurance. And the west coast of Scotland didn't see much commercial shipping, generally speaking, and is a very rough and wild area. And so there just wasn't really any interest for the U-boats to go there. And obviously for the Luftwaffe to get there, not only was it pushing the range of Luftwaffe aircraft, but they'd have to go over pretty much the entirety of the UK to get there. So again, it was a fairly safe area. And very often when you look at accounts like that of Johnny Walker and so forth, you'll see that various UK escort formations, particularly trained up off the west coast of Scotland before they headed off with convoys and such. And indeed, you can kind of see this if you go to the wonderful ArcGIS map of sunken ships in the Second World War, because then you look at the Channel, you look at the eastern coast of the UK, and it's just absolutely rammed with ships being sunk. Obviously, the Atlantic has got ships sunk all over the place as well. But then when you look at the Irish Sea, apart from a cluster in just to the north of Wales caused by a bunch of mines in 1940, there's very, very few sinkings on either side in the Irish Sea. And in actual fact, the number of U-boats sunk in the Irish Sea almost matches or potentially exceeds the number of ships sunk by U-boats in the Irish Sea. Although there is quite a cluster of ships being sunk at the northern and southern entrances to the Irish Sea. But then you go and look at what they call in the UK the Western Isles, the western coast of Scotland. And in that whole training area, there's there's 3 U-boats and 2 Allied ships sunk, and that's it. That's literally everything. And one of those are sunk by a mine in terms of Allied losses. Minesweeper sunk in 1939, and the other one's a cargo ship sunk right at the end of the war by U-boat, which ironically enough is then itself sunk by depth charges a few dozen miles south of its victim. Now, in terms of strategic impact of these areas, they were incredibly important, not just in terms of getting brand new crews up to speed for, say, newly produced U-boats or escort vessels in the Allied case, but also because it meant that ships that had been repaired, ships that had been refitted, ships that had had partial crew transfers, etc., could also get worked up. Machinery faults that had been theoretically rectified could be checked to see if they had actually been rectified. And of course, in a relatively safe environment, you can also have a lot of fragile things like high-speed launches and flying boats, etc., on hand to recover people when things do go a little bit wrong, like, say, on Lake Michigan, if people miss the aircraft carrier and end up in the drink, and so on and so forth. And so not only increases the ability of your Navy to bring your ships and subs and so forth up to speed without actually throwing them headlong into combat, but it also means that if they do make mistakes, and they will, because that's the nature of training, you're in a much better position to rescue them. Once you lose access to that, then you're basically taking a position of, well, we have this brand new vessel with potentially a brand new crew. The minute they go beyond this harbour, and towards the end of the war, perhaps if you're the Japanese, not even then, you're immediately in the war zone. Have fun, good luck, and try not to die in the next 5 seconds. Hilo3825 asks, on the South American arms race, why was there not a build-up again like before World War I? Was it due to their economic downturn or the Washington Naval Treaty restricting the sale of larger capital ships? And with regards to HMS Eagle, were the Chileans ever interested in getting her back as a carrier? Part of it was the Washington Treaty said, yeah, you're not allowed to build capital ships in the building holiday, even if you're exporting it to other people. Now, obviously, the various navies in South America did build further ships. They did order other ships from overseas, cruisers particularly, but also destroyers and so forth. So they were still building up and regenerating their navies. But also, from an economic perspective, World War I was pretty terrible for the South American countries, and that's for quite a variety of different reasons. And of course, I'm not an economic historian, so this is very high level. But essentially, World War I forced, mostly in Germany, admittedly, but also to a certain extent in Britain and the US, the invention and adoption of wide-scale synthetic manufacturing for certain things like rubber and nitrates, which heretofore had been quite valuable exports for South America. And now, of course, they would continue to be very valuable exports from South America, and to a certain degree they even are today, but there was now a competing source, which meant that as demand went up, prices wouldn't necessarily follow for the purely natural versions, because there was, there's a certain price point at which building your artificial production plants at home and doing it yourself will become more economically attractive. Plus, everybody was made poorer, generally speaking, by the First World War, which meant there was less money to spend importing things from other countries. The South American countries themselves were also becoming somewhat more advanced, technologically speaking, and their sort of standard of living was going up, which meant that the cost of production was going up slightly as well. And of course, if the cost of the product that you're trying to export has gone up, then even all other issues aside, someone at the other end with a limited amount of money is going to buy less of it and potentially look for other cheaper sources. So the difference between the same product produced somewhere else compared to the South American export offering was becoming less and less. The Panama Canal, opening obviously at the start of the First World War, also really didn't help. Now, you might think that should help because it would mean that places like Brazil could export to the west coast of the US, and places like Argentina, Chile, and Peru could export to Europe somewhat easier. However, it also meant that whereas previously, if you'd wanted to trade from, say, the US East Coast or Europe, and you'd wanted to trade with various parts of the Pacific, including the US West Coast and the West Coast of South America, for example, you had to go around South America. And that meant that a lot of ships would be passing through in both directions along the South American coast. And, well, while they're there, they might as well do some trade and make some money. If nothing else, they're going to be using port facilities, and you've been making money from docking fees and refueling and so forth. The Panama Canal allows you to bypass that entirely. So that cuts a big chunk of trade, the incidental trade, if you like, coming past. And there's a few other things like devaluing of major currencies and whether or not they're on the gold standard and so forth, which also affect things. But essentially what it meant was that the South American countries were not in a position to make as much money as they were before World War I from their various exports, and therefore, even if battleship building was possible, they didn't have the money and therefore the ambition to do so. As far as were the Chileans interested in HMS Eagle as a carrier, it doesn't seem to be so. They seem to have, when they approached the British to say, hey, can we have our ships back, their first question was, can you put Eagle back into battleship format, please? Sam Signorelli asks, a slight continuation of my comment about the US seemingly 3D printing Liberty ships, just how exactly did they build them so fast? Well, it was a series of iterations, essentially. I mean, obviously having vast amounts of shipyard facilities helped, but they took a design that was already pretty simple, quick, easy and cheap to build, and then they adapted it for US construction, which made things slightly cheaper and easier still. Then they substituted in riveting with welding. So they welded the ship instead of riveted it. That saved a huge amount of time because, assuming you had the trained people, since this wasn't a warship, welding essentially standard grades of steel together was a lot faster than riveting it all together. And because there were orders for vast numbers of these things, they could also afford to place massive batch orders for prefabricated components that could then be dropped into place. So rather than having to build everything from scratch on site or order things in small batch units, where there's going to be delays of components arriving from the time of order to time of delivery, you could just say to various industries, okay, we want this many vertical triple expansion engines, we want this many boilers, we want this many prefabricated superstructures, etc., etc. We want this many deck hatches, this many steam cranes, and they would just start cranking them out, so when you needed them, they were just there and available. So once you've got everything there and available, you're working on it like an assembly line, you've got nice fast construction with welding, and you've got vast numbers of people being put to work to construct the things, and of course the more they construct the same thing, the faster they get at it. Suddenly you end up with loads and loads and loads and loads of Liberty ships being built very quickly. W. Osterberg asks, when the Royal Navy was trying to get 16-inch guns for the 1939 Lion-class battleships, could the US Navy have sold them the 16-inch 50 guns that had been made for the 1920s South Dakota-class battleships and Lexington-class battle cruisers? By then, the US Navy had figured out these guns weren't going to work on the Iowas. Theoretically, yes. In very basic terms, the gun's weight between the British 16-inch 45 they were designing and the American 16-inch 50, as per the Lexington and South Dakota, wasn't that different. However, the US guns would obviously be of a completely different length. Their point of balance is going to be in a different area. They're going to be designed for using completely different shells and so forth. So you'd be faced with a similar problem to that which the Iowas faced, in that the guns didn't work with the turrets in the Iowas, and so you'd have the same problem here, just for slightly different reasons, in that obviously the turret, the British turret, the loading mechanisms, the hoists, etc., would have been designed to work with British shells of the specific size and weight that the Lion class were going to use. And if you then drop in, oh, actually now we're using these 16-inch 50s, you'd either have to try and see if you could make the 16-inch 50s work with the British shells, or you'd have to redesign all the turret internals to cope with American shells, or at least American spec shells for those particular guns. And whatever the case, you'd have to redesign the turret's internals anyway to position the guns at a better point of balance and so on and so forth. This minor weight issue of the guns themselves is relatively easy to overcome. All those other issues, though, would have been quite a lot more complex. And to be perfectly honest, around about the time when they were realizing that the 16-inch gun wasn't going to be ready in time was also around about the time they were prioritizing other kinds of ships anyway. Plus, of course, the other problem would be if you use the American 16-inch 50 guns, then unless you set up a whole infrastructure to support them in the UK, because bear in mind they use different rifling, different construction methods, etc., every time a Lion class needed its guns replaced and relined, you'd have to take it over to the States, which would be quite a bit of a problem, both just logistically and also in terms of strategic dependence. Hark asks, could you give us the history of torpedo juice, and if you have the time, tell us more about similar or related exploits in a sailor's eternal quest to get hammered? And could you also perhaps shed some light on why on earth anyone would be that desperate to get alcohol if they're not already dependent on it due to outright addiction? Is it really that good? Well, in brief, the Mark 14 torpedo, which is the one at the top of this picture, the other one being the Mark 13, its main fuel was essentially 100% pure alcohol. So obviously, initially, people were just like, aha, well, we can tap some of this fuel, and then, well, we have alcohol. Now, of course, drinking 100% pure alcohol, even if it is technically human drinkable, i.e. doesn't have other stuff in it that won't immediately kill you, is still not brilliant. So you have to cut it so that you don't completely overwhelm your system. And so the traditional recipe was 3 parts of whatever citrus juice you happen to have on hand, because, hey, if you're on a submarine, beggars can't be choosers, with 2 parts of alcohol from the torpedo. Technically speaking, that would give you a drink that was 40% ABV, or 80 proof in modern parlance. Exact proof levels slightly vary over time, but for the modern viewers, you're essentially creating an 80 proof or 48% ABV drink, so something along the lines of a decent whiskey in terms of strength. Then, of course, the US Navy caught on to this. The US Navy was supposed to be a dry navy, i.e. no alcohol regularly allowed, and, well, also tapping your torpedo fuel wasn't exactly encouraged, could have some negative impacts on performance. And so the Navy started introducing progressively more and more inventive mild toxins, stuff that make you horribly ill rather than kill you, in an attempt to stop people tapping the fuel. And of course that just meant people got more and more inventive, creating various filters and stills to get rid of said contaminants. As for why people would go to such lengths to get a hold of alcohol when they're not necessarily functional alcoholics, well, there's the saying in the military that it's 99% sheer outright boredom and 1% abject terror, and, well, even on a submarine, that's by and large true. So if you're stuck in a small metal cylinder with a bunch of other people, and most of the time you're probably bored off your face, then while you're obviously not going to want to get absolutely hammered, because then you'll get in trouble, getting slightly buzzed might help things just move on through the day considerably easier than just having to stand watch for hours upon hours upon hours upon hours on end. And for the record, I did at one point actually record a video all about torpedo juice. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on what perspective you're looking at it from, I decided to recreate the torpedo juice with some imported 100% ABV pure alcohol. Turns out the only places that manufacture the stuff are Poland and the US. And set it all up, got it all mixed, drank it, documented the experience as it went through my system, which was rather interesting. But it was only once I'd got partway through making it, I realised I somehow messed up, not the ratios, but the volume. And I'd ended up pouring enough of the 100% alcohol to make up the total amount that I wanted to drink originally. And then I was just like, well, you know what, I can't pour it back in the bottle, forgetting I had a funnel somewhere in the kitchen. So I just topped it up proportionally with, I think it was grapefruit juice, down the whole lot. And that was possibly an inadvisably large amount of pure alcohol to drink all at one point, because my documenting of the effects basically consisted of me going nothing, nothing, nothing for 5 to 10 minutes, and then gradually losing feeling in my fingers and toes, and that loss of feeling gradually spreading up my limbs until I realised, okay, well, when it gets to my knees, this could be a problem, at which point I drank 2 litres of orange juice and took myself off to bed before my knees stopped working, went to sleep, and woke up perfectly fine the next day. It was one of the weirder experiences I've had with alcohol. Brad in SoCal asks, what was the composition of the air wing for escort carriers that worked best for escorting a convoy in transit? Was it primarily recon and fighter aircraft or something else? This actually varied quite a bit during the course of the Second World War. Initially somewhat dictated by the size and capacity of the early escort carriers, but then once the escort carriers really got going, it was also a factor of what else was available and what environment were they operating in. So the very earliest escort carriers put to use had a pure fighter complement. And that was partly because, well, longer range strike aircraft like Swordfishes or Avengers were considerably larger and heavier, and therefore more difficult to store, and potentially could also need a longer runway, which in terms of the escort carrier's flight deck, they may not necessarily have had. And the same thing, obviously, heavier aircraft needs more robust recovery systems as well. And these initial escort carriers were actually more about dealing with the Luftwaffe air threat from things like the Condor than they were dealing with submarines. They could deal with submarines, obviously they could go out and spot them, but a Martlet-Wildcat at that point only really had the option of diving and strafing the thing with its 50 cals as a method of attack. So obviously considerably more useful against aircraft. But as time went on, and as I said, you got more and more capable aircraft carriers for escort purposes, and they started being deployed deeper into the Atlantic, where there was still potential to run into enemy aircraft, especially as you get further east, but it became more and more about the submarines. Then you would still have a limited number of fighters for air defense, because a Condor would go after a defenseless escort carrier if it could, and to take out general patrol aircraft and such like. But more and more you would see fighters of varying descriptions, usually Wildcat-Martlet types, being used as patrol and defense aircraft, but the majority of the air wing, both by volume and number, being made up of long-distance patrol aircraft, like, as I said, the Swordfish or the Avenger, because those aircraft, as well as having a longer range and a navigator to help them do those long-range patrols, were also far more capable of carrying anti-submarine weaponry, like depth charges and rockets and such like, and they could be used for actively hunting down submarines, as well as obviously spotting them, and thus, by kind of the mid-part of the usage period for escort carriers, the patrol aircraft would either be the majority, or in some cases, in things like merchant aircraft carriers, the entirety of that carrier's air group, reflecting both the fact that they were being used much more as anti-sub rather than anti-aircraft vessels, and also the fact that the threat from the Condors was gradually diminishing, whereas the threat from the U-boats was increasing. And with the advent of hunting groups that could operate away from the convoys, you also needed hunting aircraft to go with them. Vokir asks, how do you think Norge and Eisvold or any of the other capital units of the minor European navies would have been used had they managed to escape into Free Navy service? I think it would vary quite widely. So there's some clues in what happened to some of the surviving Norwegian coastal defence ships once the Germans took over, and that was essentially they were turned into flak vessels for the most part. So something like Norge or Eisvold, honestly, while I don't think the Allies in 1940, let's say the British, would have turned them into flak vessels specifically, I think they probably would have been turned into either guard ships, because they've got a fairly decent armament, so they could relieve a fair number of other vessels from those duties, but ultimately they are relatively short range, relatively small, relatively shallow draft vessels, so you're not going to be sending them on long-distance convoy escort missions, because it's just not worth it. And even a Hipper class in a one-on-one in open sea probably stands a decent chance of putting down one of these things. I mean, it's got the speed, it's got the firepower advantage, etc. So not particularly practical in that respect. But either as a coastal guard vessel at various ports, potentially quite useful there. Possibly also they could have been used as a kind of shore bombardment monitor, much in the same way that Erebus and Terror ended up being used. Obviously, Terror on the North African coast, Erebus all over the place, including at the D-Day bombardments. But of course, you have different things like Kyklios and Lemnos, the pre-dreadnoughts that the Greek Navy had. Now, of course, they are somewhat more useful. Those, potentially, if they'd been a little bit updated, could have been used as convoy escorts, because, okay, yeah, a Scharnhorst or something like that is still going to have them for breakfast, but against anything that's not that, up to and including, I would even possibly say a Panzerschiff, they would be more than capable of standing off against them, and I don't think a Hipper or a Deutschland that sees them is going to risk going after the convoy. They could also, of course, be used in the shore bombardment role, or much like Georges Avrov, as convoy escorts over in, say, the Indian Ocean against, again, potential Japanese surface raiders in that case. Ron G asks, how does the experience of the Japanese admirals compare to the American admirals at the beginning of World War II? Which had more or better combat experience? In terms of direct combat experience, the Japanese admirals generally had more of it, because if you're looking at American flag officers, they essentially have three broad opportunities to get what you might term combat experience to varying degrees. Obviously, there's the Spanish-American War, which is straight-up combat experience if you happen to be at one of the battles. Then you have various US interventions between then and, well, going on even into the 20s, to be perfectly honest. And then you have the short American involvement in the First World War. However, the Spanish-American War was, roughly speaking, 40 years prior to the American involvement in World War II. So the only people who'd had any kind of combat experience from that war would be extremely senior officers, people like Lee and King, and even then in a very junior role. Then you've got, obviously, experience in interventions, which it's technically combat experience in that someone was shooting back at you, but I wouldn't necessarily class it as peer-on-peer combat experience. And then, of course, you have the First World War, where obviously you would have some officers who had been with 6th Battle Squadron, with the Grand Fleet, others who'd been with Simms's destroyers, and so on and so forth. And some officers obviously would have had experience with all three, or two out of those three. But then once you get into the 20s, outside of the odd intervention, there's not really a whole lot going. Whereas for the Japanese, they have primarily, again, three areas to pick up potential combat experience: the Russo-Japanese War, World War I again, and then the ongoing hostilities with China in the immediate run-up to World War II. And that meant that there were just more Japanese officers with more combat experience, because the Russo-Japanese War was a bit more drawn out and certainly a lot more of a peer-on-peer conflict than the Spanish-American War, and had the advantage of taking place 5 to 6 years after the Spanish-American War, which meant more Japanese officers were still around and in service who had been there. And obviously some of the more senior ones, like Yamamoto, would have been in somewhat more senior positions than some of his American counterparts who may have been in the Spanish-American War. The Japanese are also obviously involved in World War I for considerably longer than the Americans, and they have various occupations and assaults and so forth in the Pacific, plus some anti-submarine patrol experience in the Mediterranean. Obviously, they don't have the fleet experience that 6th Battle Squadron does, but then unfortunately, depending on how you're looking at it, the High Seas Fleet never came out, so 6th Battle Squadron didn't get direct fighting experience. And then, of course, in the 1930s, as Japan went after China, etc., the Japanese fleet was involved in combat operations there. Again, admittedly, the Chinese Navy wasn't really that great an opposition, but they were still operating under combat conditions, attacking coastal fortifications, and particularly for carrier admirals, although obviously they're not fighting other carriers, they did get an idea of how to operate aircraft carriers and their pilots to gain actual, flight experience where people were shooting back at them. So, broadly speaking, going into the war, the average Japanese flag officer would have had more and theoretically better combat experience than the Americans, but neither had had any peer-on-peer major naval combat experience for quite considerable time. Reaver's Rambling Recess asks, given the speed of technological progress, for whatever reason the Royal Navy kept everything around anyway, so just how long would the very earliest ironclads like Warrior, or Monitor in the US's case, or Gloire, actually remain militarily useful? So I think there's two layers to that. Firstly is what kind of vessel are the very earliest ironclads a particular navy actually has, because, for example, Monitor, as the progenitor of her type, apart from the fact she obviously sank quite quickly, but even assuming that she hadn't, the Monitor type is a relatively limited coastal defense vessel. It's not really suitable for overseas power projection, It's not particularly fast, and as it turns out, the guns that it can carry are both limited and, between its slow speed, limited combat area, and their relatively speaking low power for their caliber, they were very quickly outclassed. Now, you could refit the guns, theoretically, with newer ones, but you're still left with a relatively slow vessel that can only operate in certain environments safely. So the military usefulness of American Civil War era monitors on the global stage really doesn't last all that long at all, in any way, shape or form. Gloire suffers a slightly different problem in that she's wooden-hulled, and it turns out very quickly that wooden-hulled ships, whether purpose-built or converted from existing wooden hulls, once you slap a ton of armor plating, etc. on them, they don't have anywhere near the same lifespan as either a pure iron vessel or a wooden vessel, because obviously the weight of the iron drags and distorts at the frame, and water gets in, and rust and rot and all sorts of things. But if you have an iron-hulled ironclad, like Warrior, or Couronne in France, for example, those are going to last a lot longer. So, they're somewhat higher speed than a monitor. They're capable of being ocean-going vessels. And to be perfectly honest, they're also much easier to refit with updated guns, even if their armor can't really be updated all that much. Now, in terms of how long such a vessel can then remain militarily useful, it would follow a series of steps, which is generally what you tend to see happening with most late 19th century combatants. So when initially launched, they're frontline vessels. So if we use the Royal Navy as an example, that means the Channel Squadron or potentially the Mediterranean Fleet. Once they're no longer useful as the frontline vessels, so the lead ship's flagship, etc., they will still be there as secondary vessels, perhaps in a second or third battle squadron. Then they'll move out of, practical frontline use at all, and then they may be used as foreign station flagships, because, an early 1860s ironclad, okay, by the early 1870s, 10 years after it commissions, is definitely not a frontline vessel anymore. But if you send it over to somewhere like the Western Pacific or the South American coast, most of those places either don't have ironclads of their own, or if they do, they're of relatively limited capacity or very few in number. So the utility of even an older ironclad, but with updated guns, is still quite valuable in those areas. And you also have to factor in that even in closer waters, while militarily something like Warrior might be obsoleted by the latest and greatest, the fact is that even in the mid-1870s, the latest and greatest would be a small handful of ships, and the vast majority would be older vessels with which a upgunned ship like Warrior might still be competitive. And you actually see this with Warrior's career. She's front line for about a decade, and then she goes off to be a training vessel, which is another use for those kind of things. And she's still seen as somewhat militarily useful in the late 1870s, when they're thinking they might have to go toward Russia again, mostly on the basis I just described, that yes, the Russians might have a few modern warships, but so does the Royal Navy, and Warrior is still superior to, or at least equal to, a good number of the older Russian warships, which they would have to bring out to support their newer ones. So that's probably about as far as you could take it. I would say an early ironclad, assuming it was a good ocean-going one with an iron hull, would probably have about 20 years of total militarily useful lifespan, half of which would be frontline, and the second half of which would be useful but not really capable of taking on the absolute latest enemy vessels. And then once you get into the 1880s, it's not really going to be that useful at all, because once you get to that point, the ship will have been surpassed in speed, protection, and any reasonable amount of firepower you could actually put on it, at which point it's not really worth keeping. at least as a military asset. It obviously has other uses as a training vessel and accommodation vessel and so forth, but not as a fighting ship. Stefan Perot asks, why was Lord Cochrane chosen over Captain Harvey of the Temeraire for command of the fleet at Basque Roads? Was this a good call by Admiral Gambier or favouritism? And what's your opinion about Harvey in general? So the whole Basque Road situation is very complex and probably needs its own video or possibly pair of videos to examine. But essentially, Gambier had nothing to do with Cochrane's appointment in the attack. So what had happened was you had the French. This is a very, very brief version. There's a lot of details omitted, but basically the French fleet at Brest managed to break out when gales and storms drove the blockading squadron away. They didn't get very far, though, and they were forced to take shelter in the Basque Roads, and Admiral Gambier's squadron showed up shortly thereafter to blockade them. Various shenanigans ensued, but essentially various captains, including Captain Harvey, aboard at that point Tonnant, known for his command of Temeraire during the Battle of Trafalgar, were strongly advocating that Gambier should press the attack because the French were bottled up and there was a good chance to destroy the rebuilt French Atlantic force basically where they sat. Gambier, however, facilitated and prevaricated and basically sat outside doing pretty much nothing. Meanwhile, back in the UK, Cochrane had shown up in command of the frigate that he was in charge of at the time, and a few years ago he'd actually come up with a plan to attack a French fleet in the Basque Roads, and well, now there was a French fleet in the Basque Roads, and a lot of officers in Gambier's squadron were essentially complaining back home to people back home that, hey, Gambier's not actually doing anything, and Cochrane is then told, hey, you wanted to attack the Basque Roads a few years ago, didn't you? Yes. Okay, guess what? Now you're doing it. And in all of this, Cochrane, despite his other personality traits, actually comes off as the most sensible and level-headed of them. He's not doing particularly well health-wise at that point, although that will change. But he's very aware that he is very much a junior officer compared to someone like Gambier or even some of the more senior commanders like Harvey. And he basically says, no, I do want to attack the Basque Roads, but if you send me in command of a bunch of fireships and bomb vessels over the heads of all these people who are already on station, it's going to go down really badly. And he actually just, when they say, look, do you want to do this? No. Do you want to do this? No. Are you sure you don't want, you want to do this? No, I really, really don't. And then because obviously traditionally the Admiralty offers you a command and generally you accept it. Well, in this case, Cochrane was refusing. But then eventually the Admiralty turns around and says, well, whether you like it or not, you're going. Here's written orders. Off you go. And Cochrane at that point doesn't have much of a choice. You have to go if the Admiralty directly orders you to. So, okay, fine. He rolls up to Gambier's squadron with his collection of close-in attack craft. And remember, it's not just about Cochrane wanting to attack the Basque Roads specifically. He's built a reputation over the past few years as an exceptional officer when it comes to attacking close-in enemy positions. And naturally, exactly what Cochrane thought occurs. A bunch of officers go, hang on a minute, why on earth is Cochrane in charge of this operation? This is the operation we've been asking you to do for weeks, Gambier. And now this junior officer shows up from the UK and he's in charge? No, we should be in charge. But everyone is kind of boxed into a corner because there's direct orders from everyone's superiors. So Cochrane goes ahead, Cochrane attacks the French fleet. Gambier watches Cochrane succeed, does nothing, and just kind of sits there, which infuriates everyone even more. Cochrane just goes, oh, well, you know what, stuff it. If no one's going to help me, I'll just have to do it myself, and continues to attack the French fleet, destroying a good chunk of it, although some of it escapes because he has limited resources compared to Gambier's squadron. And then at the end, rightfully so, I think, Cochrane launches a tirade against Gambier because he's like, look, we had a perfect opportunity. Any officer worth his salt would have come in and helped finish them off, and you sat there and did nothing. And a lot of Gambier's subordinate captains and other officers pretty much agree with Cochrane. The only problem then is that Gambier, who's a middling officer at best. Relatively decent as an individual ship's captain, but as a flag officer, I don't really rate him that much. He basically just uses his seniority to send people who he disagrees with back to London to a court-martial. The only problem he has is that Cochrane is also a member of Parliament, so Cochrane then uses his position as an MP to have a go at Gambier, which then means Gambier forces Cochrane into, forces a court-martial of himself to try and clear his name, and of course, because Gambier has a lot of political connections, he makes sure the court-martial is stacked with his mates, who clear him. Literally nobody else does. Cochrane doesn't forgive him. Harvey, for that matter, doesn't forgive him. And pretty much every naval historian ever since then has said Gambier was a bit of a lunatic and an idiot for not supporting Cochrane, and even worse for the way he handled the circumstances. So, yeah, but in the immediate term, it meant the temporary end of Cochrane's career. Harvey's career, actually, as well, was pretty much done for by crossing paths with Gambier in a negative way. Harvey himself was a pretty decent officer, a little bit arrogant, in my opinion, but certainly a much better officer, I think, than Gambier was. Miko Leitner asks, both Admiral King and Yamamoto at one point commanded aircraft carriers. Is this purely a coincidence, or was experience with naval aviation a prerequisite to the highest levels of command in the run-up to World War II? It wasn't a prerequisite, no. The fact that both King and Yamamoto had commanded carriers is somewhat coincidental, but also somewhat not. I mean, you look at someone like Leahy, the senior-most admiral, technically, in the US Navy, along with King, and apart from very briefly hoisting his flag in USS Ranger as more of a symbolic gesture, Leahy never actually commanded a carrier at all, and yet, well, there he was right at the top of the pecking order. Which, that kind of reflects you don't need to have done so to be at the highest levels of command. And just at a level immediately below them, Nimitz never commanded a carrier, which is somewhat ironic given that he has a class of carriers named after him. But there you go. So the reason I say why it's coincidental but also kind of not is that while you could attain a very high rank in both the Japanese Navy and the US Navy without actually ever having commanded a carrier, the fact is that carriers were beginning to show signs of being the future of naval warfare, and regardless of whether or not you recognize that per se, they were still an exciting new technology, and therefore officers who are very interested in the latest and greatest technology tend to be very driven and will then tend to seek to continue their careers, and they tend to reach high command because they have the drive to do so. And thus, for those kinds of officers, seeing a carrier as, it's big, it's pretty, it's got a bunch of new interesting things on it, therefore I want to command it, and move on their careers from there as well. And those kinds of officers would include people like King and Yamamoto, so hence they would end up with carriers at some point. So it's not so much that it's a requirement, but the kind of people who would be driven to seek carrier command are also the kind of people who would be driven to reach the highest levels of command generally. Rebel Skverl asks, what would you say were the best budget warships of each naval era? By that, I mean the best quality ships that saw service which were built according to budgetary constraints of their particular admiralty or government. Well, I mean, technically, almost every Navy ship has been built to budgetary constraints in one way, shape, or another. But if you want to say, okay, well, let's focus on ships that could have been of a certain size, displacement capability, but were built to a reduced version of what they theoretically could have been, or what the average of that type of ship was, because of various budgetary restrictions. There's some, a lot of budget ships do show the fact they are definitely budget ships, but I would put Strasbourg up there. That's why there's this picture of her. And I say specifically Strasbourg because she is significantly better protected than poor old Dunkirk. And Strasbourg is built at a time period where theoretically the French could have built a full 35,000-ton capital ship, but they chose not to for various reasons, including budget. And For what she is, Strasbourg's actually a really, really capable ship. Okay, she's not necessarily going to go toe-to-toe with a 35,000-ton treaty ship with much hope of victory, but when you look at the environment in which she was built, and even the environment in which she briefly saw service in the Second World War, if you put her up against an Italian modernized dreadnought, so basically any Italian battleship that's not the Littorios, she's got better than even chance of winning, so yay. Against Deutschland, she's going to just flatten them. I'd give her reasonably decent odds against a Scharnhorst, so that's quite good. Obviously not necessarily against a Bismarck, but then Bismarck significantly outmasses her. She's better protected, and despite having guns that are 1 inch less in caliber, thanks to their more modern design, she's actually overall, I would say, a more powerful ship than a Congo. So yeah, Strasbourg is pretty darn good, as well as obviously superior to any heavy cruiser of the period. Just a shame she didn't get to see lots of action under Free French colours. And on that note, I would say also the French and the Italians came up with quite a number of 6-inch light cruisers that were below the 10,000-ton treaty limit, but which were pretty darn capable for what they were. For that matter, there's also the Argentinian light cruiser La Argentina, which, as I said in the video about her, personally, I would have thought the Royal Navy building a bunch of slightly modified versions of La Argentina would have put them in a much better position going into the Second World War than having the random collection of Leanders and Arethuses that they historically had, at a level below the town class, but there you go. Snowstalker 36 asks, what are the pros and cons of where to launch and recover scout planes, and why were the Italians the only ones to go with a forward option? So when we're evaluating this, essentially what you need to look at is how easy is it to operate the aircraft themselves from a given position, and if you are going to operate aircraft from that position, what kind of vulnerability does it impose on the ship? Because ultimately, an aircraft has to be supported by things like aviation fuel stores, and in most cases also a hangar of some description, and that means void spaces, flammability, etc., none of which you really want on a ship if you can at all avoid it. So with that said, you can consider 3 primary positions: bow launch, as per the Italians, stern launch, like you can see here being briefly trialled on HMS Hood, and then amidships. So let's go bow to stern. The Italian method, launching aircraft straight off of the bow, it's relatively simple. The bow isn't used for all that much, and therefore, if something happens, like an aircraft catches fire, whether through enemy action or accident, apart from maybe the paint store lower down, there's nothing you really have to worry about all that much. Whereas perhaps over the stern, you've got things like the steering gear immediately below, and amidships, you've got the machinery spaces immediately below. The disadvantages, however, is that bows tend to be either negatively buoyant or close to it at the best of times. So if you've got a hangar in the bow, then, and obviously bows generally unarmoured, then all it takes is one decent shell hit and suddenly you've got a massive exposed volume which could be vulnerable to flooding, which combined with the already mostly negatively buoyant nature of bows, that's going to have a very dramatic effect on the ship if that hit occurs, even given the fact it's well outside the citadel. Also, if it catches fire, generally ships are heading forward, which means you're going to have a big sheet of flame heading back over your main armament and bridge, which isn't great unless you either slow down and or steer into a very strong crosswind. The catapults on the bow are also fixed, so if you want to launch the aircraft, you have to change course to do so, which could be a problem. And ultimately, obviously, the bow gets the most water green over it, so the potential of damage to the aircraft, damage to the catapults, a period where you can't launch the aircraft, or even water penetrating the hangar, that's all a big problem with bow launches, which is why the Italians only briefly did it and then didn't repeat it. Then amidships, you have the ability to launch on either side, which theoretically means you have more options. Otherwise, you still have to course correct a little bit to launch, but you do have a lot more options in that regard. You can obviously fit a very large hangar very wide hangar. You can store lots of aircraft. That's good. And as I said, you're very unlikely to get water up there. So all of this is quite useful. However, the middle of the ship is also where you might want to put your secondary and anti-aircraft batteries. So there's a lot of competition for space. If you do get hit, then, well, there's a bunch of burning material potentially directly amidships, which isn't a good thing. You don't, however, have issues running into the ship's main battery gun blast, which is quite nice. And of course, if you turn and cause a bit of a dead zone, well, if your recovery cranes are amidships, that's also a nice area for the aircraft to come up to and be recovered from. So generally quite good, but your main problem is going to be it's just taking up a space that a lot of other things are competing for. And then you have a stern. Now, usually ships that launch aircraft from a stern don't have hangars because, well, the main armament's in the way, and directly beneath the stern upper deck is going to be things like the steering gear and the rise of the hull for the propellers, so there's just not the space. So US fast battleships, for instance, didn't have hangars. So you remove the hangar vulnerability. That's quite nice. Generally, these aircraft are mounted on a turntable, so you can launch them at almost any angle, regardless of what direction the ship is going, which is also good. If things do catch fire, well, you can just chuck them over the back, again, relatively quickly and easily. Downsides, of course, well, they're exposed. Not quite as exposed as if they're up on the bow, but still exposed, and so they can get weather damage. If the main guns go into action at anything other than broadside on or aiming forward, you're probably going to get blast damage. You can't carry that many, and if you do end up with an extensive fire from fuel stores and everything, then of course, again, the steering gear and such may be vulnerable. Obviously, hopefully you've battened everything down, closed all the hatches, etc., but there could still be issues. So essentially, it comes down to realistically stern mounting or midships mounting, and at that point, it broadly, unless you happen to have a ship that's so large you can have a stern hangar, like say the Yamatos, you're normally looking at, if you want to retain your aircraft on a long-term basis and you're prepared to put up with losing some secondary and anti-aircraft firepower midships, then the midships option is the one to go for. If you view the aircraft as more as an expendable item, then sure, stick them on the stern and you'll get a slightly more powerful overall ship for it. Robert Henry Ilston asks, looking back on your rangefinder question and videos, was the efficiency of dazzle camouflage patterns based more on the view of the ship through the rangefinders rather than just the naked eye? It depended a lot on the type of dazzle camo involved, because some dazzle camo was just designed to confuse the observer as to what direction the ship was going or even what size and shape the ship was, kind of like this on this dazzle camo pattern on an MTB. And obviously that is designed to work more against the naked eye, or someone using, say, a periscope or something like that to just try and get some information about the ship rather than necessarily trying to range off of it completely. Whereas other dazzle camos were designed specifically to mess with the ability to get accurate range finding. And obviously, because you have coincidence and stereoscopic range finding, different dazzle camos will work with differing levels of effectiveness on those two types of rangefinders in very different ways, to the extent that actually a dazzle camo might help very much against one type of rangefinder and not against another. So taking this boat as an example, even though, as we've said, this is more designed for the direct visual observation type of camo, this is the kind of image you'd get of this vessel if you're looking at it through a coincidence rangefinder where the two images are offset. Now, A, it does look like a bit of a mess, admittedly, and B, as you can see, some of the lines actually kind of line up with each other, but you can see that there is still a distinct beginning and end to this vessel, and actually, as you were to align the top and bottom images, the fact that there are so many distinct points actually gives you a very, very good set of references to work out whether or not you have them perfectly aligned or not. So this is a case of actually where dazzle camo would be a negative against a coincidence style rangefinder, because it actually makes the job of the person on the rangefinder somewhat easier once they realize what they're looking at. Now, don't adjust your screens, but feel free to look away if you have some issues with this kind of image. But yeah, this is the kind of image, roughly speaking, that you would see of such a vessel in this kind of dazzle camo looking through a stereoscopic rangefinder, which is out of focus. So, i.e. the rangefinder is set to a distance that the target is not. As you can see, you've got two essentially ghosts of the vessel overlaid over each other, and as you can see, it's complete and utter disaster. It makes your brain hurt, and yes, there's bows and there's sterns, but what the heck is going on? How do you line them up? That's a little bit of a brain twister. So possibly this is more effective against a stereoscopic rangefinder. And then we move over to the next bit. And here, this is actually confirmation that this particular dazzle camo scheme is considerably more effective against a stereoscopic than a coincidence rangefinder, because while it might look like just a slightly blurrier version of the original, which you can see here, and thus compared to the horrible offset that you had before, you might be willing to consider this slightly blurry version to be, okay, this is actually fine, this is something we're going to base our fire control solution off. Maybe there's haze, or the ship's movement vibration is just causing this. But in actual fact, this is what you'd see through a stereoscopic rangefinder that is ever so slightly misaligned, because obviously I took one image copy, set it to a degree of opacity so I know exactly where it's aligned, and it's aligned ever so slightly up and ever so slightly left compared to the original, just enough that it looks like a blurred version of the original, and you might not necessarily think that it is completely out of whack, but if you then base your fire control solution off of this, your shots would be landing somewhat off target. But you could find another example of dazzle camo, and you'd have almost the inverse effect, where it's very easy to tell that it's off target using stereoscopic rangefinders, but very difficult to tell that you're off target using a coincidence rangefinder. So it really depends on exactly which dazzle camo scheme you're looking at. DM Phoenix asks, is it always preferable to designate the largest, most powerfully armed vessel in one's fleet as flagship, or are there times where this is to be avoided for some reason or another? Are there instances where you might disagree with an admiral's choice of flagship? No, it's not always preferable, although the reasons for this will vary depending on era. So, for example, in the Age of Sail, the very largest and most powerfully armed vessel in your fleet may not be the most suitable as a flagship for a variety of reasons. If it's, say, the only three-decker in your fleet, it might be a very obvious target. But also, even if you have multiple three-deckers in your fleet, it may not be the most capable ship, despite being the biggest and most powerfully armed. So, for example, at the Battle of Trafalgar, Santissima Trinidad was the largest and most powerfully armed ship on either side. However, she also had the sailing qualities of a barn, and therefore really wasn't a particularly good flagship unless you just wanted to kind of vaguely wander in the general direction of the enemy while telling everybody else what to do. And understandably, Admiral Gravina therefore chose a ship that could, actually maneuver more than 2 degrees of compass per hour to be his flagship. Conversely, the British fleet, Nelson, although he was having his flag aboard Victory, which was one of the first rates, Victory was not just a large and powerful vessel, one of the largest and most powerful in the British fleet, but she was also one of the swiftest and most agile of the three-deckers, so it made a good amount of sense for her to be flagship. But then as you move forward into, say, the World War I era, hence HMS Iron Duke, flagship of the Grand Fleet for a good chunk of time, there's good reasons why she was flagship at Jutland, despite there being significantly more powerful vessels available, such as the Queen Elizabeth class or even the early ships of the Revenge class. Now, of course, at Jutland specifically, 5th Battle Squadron was off with Beatty, but that was not always the case, and it would have been entirely possible for Jellicoe to select one of the Queen Elizabeth class as his flagship at some point between their introduction to the fleet and then the call for 5th Battle Squadron to go and work with Beatty, which probably would have put a bit of a spanner in the works, or at least seen the fleet flagship stay behind. But instead he chose to remain with Iron Duke, and of course, as I said, he could have chosen one of the newly arrived Revenge class, which definitely would be with his fleet. Again, bigger, more powerful than Iron Duke, but he didn't. And there's various reasons for this. Firstly, of course, Iron Duke could operate with the other vessels in her class as a homogeneous unit. She was much more suited to operating in the battle line. That played to her strengths, whereas the Queen Elizabeth class, to play to their strengths, even if they'd been in the battle line, they should have been at the front of the fleet, which is not necessarily where you want the Admiral to be in a massive battle line like that at Jutland, where you need to relay orders to everybody by flag. And there's also continuity. If the fleet goes through multiple exercises where this is the flagship, this squadron is the flag squadron, this is where everything is positioned, you don't want to be going, okay, by the way, everyone, all of that out the window, it's now this ship and this squadron. Oh, and now, 6 months, a year later, the new ship's coming. Now it's this ship and this squadron. So as long as your flagship is, in the top tier of warships, then you stay with it. And the side colliery, of course, if that ship specifically has flagship facilities, also a good idea to stay with it, as opposed to a ship that perhaps doesn't have those facilities. And then in World War II, things get even more complicated, because you now have aircraft carriers thrown into the mix, and also a relative paucity of battleships compared to, say, World War I, and potential multiple different kinds of engagement that could drag an admiral and a ship all over the place. So say you're operating in a fleet that mixes battleships and carriers. Well, carriers have to operate with the wind. They have to turn into the wind to launch their aircraft, and they have to perhaps seek out areas of weather where aircraft launching opportunities are favourable. They're somewhat vulnerable to damage, so you don't really want them right up on the front line. And when they're launching or recovering aircraft, they're going to be very busy doing that. So while the aircraft carrier might be the physically largest vessel in your fleet, and depending on how you view the balance of power between battleships and carriers at any given point in World War II, they may be the most powerfully armed vessel in the fleet, having your flagship aboard a carrier is not necessarily the wisest of ideas, because you may be taken places that you don't want to be, or that you really don't need to be, and you're going to be stepping on a lot of other people's toes, because aircraft carriers have lots of space for aircraft. They're generally speaking not known in World War II for having huge amounts of accommodation for flag officers. And then you look at the battleships. Well, if the battleships are fast enough to keep up with the aircraft carriers, then generally they're going to have to stick with the aircraft carriers, which to a certain degree puts them in the same degree of limitations as the carriers, but at least they're not doing air operations, and some battleships are fitted as flagships, but they may not be the latest battleships fitted as flagships. So, for example, if you're in let's use the US fleet as our example here, if you've got a mixture of South Dakotas, North Carolinas, and Iowas, well, the Iowa is the biggest and fastest, most powerful battleship, but USS South Dakota specifically has flagship facilities in addition to her regular facilities. Now, Iowa, for example, does also have a certain degree of flagship facilities, but if Iowa isn't there, and let's say New Jersey and Missouri are there, and you've got South Dakota and Indiana, and perhaps North Carolina and Washington, South Dakota makes more sense as a flagship at that point, because she has the facilities to handle an admiral better than perhaps New Jersey or Missouri do, even though New Jersey and Missouri are, technically speaking, the bigger and more powerful vessels. Or you could be like Admiral Lee and go, well, that's all well and good, but I don't like my CIC down in the bowels of the ship. I want my CIC where I can step into it, in 2 seconds from the bridge, at which point you're going to keep Washington as your flagship. And then again, Admiral Lee having a battleship as his flagship makes sense because he's in charge of the battleship division, whereas, say, Admiral Spruance, well, we've established why you don't necessarily want to have a carrier as your flagship if you could avoid it, and he doesn't necessarily want to be on a battleship either, because either you're going to be stuck following the carriers around, or the battleship is going to be off doing shore bombardment, or potentially they're going to be on the front line fighting enemy battleships if they show up, all of which are good and valid roles, but all of which are only a subsidiary part of the overall fleet strategy. And therefore, the Admiral, who doesn't necessarily want to be tied up, committed to any one particular portion of his overall strategy, might need a completely different ship, which is why Spruance spent a lot of time on the Indianapolis, because it was big enough to hold all of his staff and let him do the flagship element, but small enough that he could basically take her to go anywhere he wanted while the big capital ships got on with their very specific roles. Gallias of Martinengo asks, if US Navy crews had training and practice for shallow water sinking-capsizing rescue scenarios beforehand, would it have made a big difference for the rescue efforts at Pearl Harbor using the available equipment and manpower? I don't think it would have made all that much difference, to be perfectly honest, because, well, as you can probably guess from this, the vast majority of casualties were people trapped on board their ship, people killed by direct weapons impacts and so forth. And then when people went over the side, there was, of course, burning ships, burning fuel oil, and, well, the ongoing Japanese attack, amongst other things. So being extra drilled in how to get out of a ship, I mean, when a ship goes over in shallow water and capsizes compared to if it goes over and capsizes in the ocean, doesn't really make much odds in terms of the fact you want to get out of there. And, I mean, you look at the picture again, if you manage to get clear of all those hazards and you could swim, at Pearl Harbor, you could just swim to shore. And of course, you might be injured, you might be in shock, you might be exhausted, you probably weighed down by your clothing, etc. But a half-decent swimmer who managed to get clear of all the various hazards involved with a ship being under attack at Pearl Harbor could just swim to safety without boats and so forth coming to get them. Although, of course, if someone does come to get you, that's a lot better and a lot more welcome than having to swim several hundred yards for questionable safety. But, yeah, realistically, I don't think any amount of practice in abandoned ship drills of any particular description is going to massively change the casualty count for the US Navy on December 7th. Texas and La Choc asks, I recently saw a video about the Deal vertical migration, which began with how it confused and perturbed World War II sonar operators. The video approached it from a marine biology perspective, but could you come at it from a naval perspective? So the Deal vertical migration, for those of you who are unaware, is essentially a raft of small marine organisms that live further down in the depths during the day, and then at night they all rise to the surface, or closer to the surface at least, to continue their life cycle with feeding and so on and so forth. Now, obviously an individual animal, whether it be a herring or plankton or even a whale, while at the larger sizes might generate a small sonar return of its own, is not really all that much to worry about. But when you're talking about tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, potentially millions of very, very small creatures all packed together, and especially when they have things like swim bladders that contain gas, which therefore has different density to water, which therefore will reflect sonar waves, you can end up with these mass clusters of very, very small sea life that reflect sonar as if they were the seabed, which then means that in World War II, when you start to see the first, continuous large-scale usages of sonar, you might be looking at your sonar and going, okay, the seabed is, 700 yards down today. Probably using a depth sounder more than your active sub-hunting sonar, to be honest, but either way, it could be a shallow bit of the sea. But then, come nighttime, you're like, hang on a minute, the seabed's now 300 yards down. What's going on there? That's a bit weird. Is this a really big enemy sub? What's happening? Is the seabed moving? Obviously, that, as it turns out, wasn't the case. It's literally just the sea life maneuvering around. But to be perfectly honest, as far as I can tell, having looked through various sonar reports from, ASDIC reports from the Royal Navy's parlance, from the early part of World War II, it doesn't seem to have been all that remarkable for people. Yes, there was a little bit of confusion as to, that's weird, the seabed wasn't there yesterday. But, to be perfectly honest, apart from the occasional time they thought it might be an enemy submarine, most people just didn't care all that much. They just sort of looked at it and went, well, the main thing is that our draft is 20, 25, 30 feet, whatever it happens to be. The seabed's still several hundred yards down, so we don't have to worry about hitting it. And there aren't any submarines, because even with the Deal vertical migration, generally speaking, it tended to stay below the crush depth of most World War II submarines. And so it was all filed under one of those weird things you sometimes see depending on which sonar system you're using. As I say, usually the depth sounder would be the more appropriate one, but doesn't necessarily affect the day-to-day operations of sub-hunting all that much. Laker51 asks, everything I've seen on the paddle wheel era of steamship shows side wheelers. Did any naval power consider using stern wheelers, and would a stern wheel steamer carry sufficient more firepower to offset the added complexity of using that propulsion setup? There were some stern wheel paddle warships. You can see here, this is one of them. This is one of the City-class river ironclads that were used in the US Civil War. You can see there's the twin funnels roughly amidships, and there's a jaunty little curved box just aft next to the flag, and that's where the stern paddle wheel is. However, outside of this kind of use in riverine warfare in the American Civil War, they essentially don't exist outside of tugs and so forth. And that's because the stern paddle wheel is, yes, a much better solution if you want broadside firepower, but it's an absolutely terrible solution for any kind of ocean-going vessel. And that's for one major reason, and that is pitch. Because as a vessel on a river or in very shallow coastal waters isn't going to be subject to too much in the form of rough pitching, at least usually, unless you're on the Great Lakes or something like that. If you're out at sea, you are going to be subject to some pretty high waves, and thus obviously your vessel's going to be, well, it's going to be rolled as well, but in the relevant part for our discussion, it's going to be pitched up and down. If your paddles are, roughly speaking, as on the centre of the ship, kind of amidships relative to the bow and stern, then usually your propellers will remain roughly about as deep in the water, whether the ship's pitching up or pitching down. Obviously, you try and put the propellers around about somewhere in the centre of gravity or the centre of rotation, and that's even better. But if you have a stern paddle wheel, then if the ship pitches up and the stern sinks down, then suddenly a whole lot more of your paddle is submerged. And if the ship pitches down and the stern rises up, your paddle may become completely exposed from the waters. And in either case, that can put massive strain on the engine. If the paddle wheel is buried, then suddenly there's a whole lot more resistance and the engine is straining to push it forward. And if the paddle comes out of the water, then the engine is going to race. Now, of course, that could happen with screw propellers as well. However, screw propellers, of course, designed to be entirely submerged, and coming out of the water and then racing does happen in really, really bad storms, but it's only, half the problem that it would be for a paddle wheel. And thanks to the propellers being fairly deep below the water, it has to be a really bad storm, whereas any significant seas could see a stern paddle wheeler having these issues. Plus, generally speaking, a stern paddle wheeler is a pretty slow vessel, in part, not entirely, but in part because you need a fairly broad hull aft, broad stern, to accommodate it, and if you want to move at speed through water in the high seas, you need a tapering stern, which doesn't really work with a paddle wheel if you're mounting it aft. And lastly, there is rolling. Now, of course, if you have paddle wheels on either side of the ship, you could end up, if the ship rolls quite significantly, with one buried somewhat deeper and one out of the water partially or entirely, which isn't brilliant. So for the same reasons as the pitching issue with the stern wheeler is a problem. However, those paddles are, relatively speaking, compared to a stern paddle wheeler, light, or lighter, I should say, and you are usually facing one problem on one and one problem on the other. Whereas if you have a nice wide stern paddle wheel and you start rolling, you face both problems on the same paddle wheel, which is going to result in ridiculous amounts of torsional stress, and you are then either going to have your paddle wheel potentially tearing itself apart over time through accumulated stress, or you're going to have to massively overbuild it, which makes it heavy and inefficient. Ash the Lego guy asks, would it have been technologically feasible, in the absence of available time to improve the logistical issues, for any of the belligerents of World War II or World War I to have built capital ships in sections in smaller yards and then assemble them off of the stocks? Germany tried to build submarines in sections to be assembled on land, but with negative results. Could any other nation have built anything bigger than a largish destroyer that way in an emergency or crash building environment? Yes and no. There's a certain amount of modular construction you could do to capital ships if you have infrastructure issues. The French actually showed this is entirely possible. So here's Dunkirk in Brest Harbour, and as you can see, there's this pointy bit at the front that's kind of missing. So yeah, you can build a good chunk of a ship and then have the bow and or stern ready to be bolted on, quite literally in some cases, to the ship later. However, that will only serve you if you've got a slipway that's, say, 80-90% the length of the ship you want to build. If you're looking at kind of actually like they do these days with, say, the Queen Elizabeth class carriers, building them in large sections, moving those sections in and putting them all together in a dry dock, that is considerably more difficult for World War I and World War II. Simply because, well, one, most ships are built on slipways at that point rather than in dry docks or graving docks, at least when we're talking about battleships. And also the logistics of moving these large sections around. Because if you're going to move these large sections around and assemble them on a slipway, well, the technology to lift something that heavy onto a slipway just doesn't exist at that point. And even if you had that technology, well, if you're assembling them on the slipway, that implies you could actually have a slipway big enough to fit the ship, at which point you might as well build the ship on the slipway in the more traditional manner. Whereas if you were to do, as I say, like a modern construction practice of, well, here's the ship in the dock and we're going to move the various bits and pieces in, A, it requires something a bit more akin to modern infrastructure, and B, it would probably require a level of dry dock space which would imply the existence of logistics and infrastructure to a degree that you actually wouldn't need it in the first place. So even if you can find yards that will build, let's say, a battleship in 10 or 15 sections all over the place, one, you've got to guarantee that they're actually all going to fit really close to tolerance, which is going to be a little bit harder in World War I and World War II than it is going to be these days. And two, I mean, the easiest way of doing it is probably going to be in a floating dry dock, because at least in theory at that point, if you have each watertight segment, you could build them all in different places, flood the floating dry dock with all your support blocks laid out, and then while the dry dock is flooded, bring all the various pieces in, arrange them nice and neatly and ready for assembly, and then raise the dry dock again. You could do that with a conventional dry dock as well, but with a floating dry dock, at least you tend to have access at either end to maneuver the bits into place, whereas with a conventional dry dock, it's you park the stern or the bow, whichever way you want to do it, and then you have to move each piece in one by one. But it just seems like a massive load of effort and work. And as I said, if you've got a dry dock that is, say, 800, 900 feet long, well, the existence of a dry dock that size implies you also have a slipway that size, because why would you build a dry dock to hold a ship that you can't actually build? And in times of war specifically, that dry dock is going to be in very high demand for refitting and repairing other ships rather than being used to put together a kit ship. Maximus Tillman IV asks, after watching the Grim Reapers battle between the Des Moines and Vanguard, would a battlecruiser be better suited to use automatic 8-inch guns and then mission kill a heavier ship over having heavier but much slower firing weapons? Theoretically, maybe, but it would depend an awful lot on the precise circumstances of the battle, which isn't a good thing for the battlecruiser, because then obviously if those circumstances aren't met, you're pretty stuffed. And now the reason I say that is because when you look at exactly when these automatic 8-inch guns are available, that's kind of the deciding factor. If you'd ask me, would a Des Moines or a battlecruiser with Des Moines-style turrets in 1940 be a good idea? Yeah, sure, at that point. But by the time Des Moines is in service in the late 40s, you've got this advancement in fire control systems and radar as demonstrated by the Iowas and by, actually, ironically enough, given that particular battle on Grim Reaper Channel, the Vanguard herself, where they have radar-controlled fire control, which can reach out to the high 20,000s of yards quite comfortably and start dealing hits. And this is paired with a hull, like Vanguard and Iowa, which can either maintain the range or expand the range to essentially just hold it at that range. And the reason I say this is important is because much beyond about 25,000 yards, while the Des Moines guns can range out further, they have to elevate to ridiculously high elevations to do so, and the shell flight time suddenly goes into almost a minute. And in that time, we're back to, well, you can just evade by the flash of the guns at that point very, very, very easily. Not to mention that out at, say, 30,000 yards, the armour-piercing capability of even a super heavy 8-inch shell just isn't enough to penetrate either the deck or belt armour of an Iowa or Vanguard. Now, sure, yes, it can mess it up if you can get lots of hits, but as I said, between the ridiculous shell flight time and therefore probable inaccuracy and the lack of armour penetration capability, the chances of you actually getting those hits is fairly minimal. Now, of course, yes, Des Moines has a similar level of a modern fire control system, but it's much harder to predict where a shell is going to land if it has a flight time of 50 to 60 seconds as compared to 25 to 30 seconds. And, of course, the flip side is the 15 or 16-inch shells coming back the other way. Well, they don't really care about Des Moines armour or most theoretical battle cruisers' armour. Now, if the theoretical 8-inch automatic firing battle cruiser can get within 24,000 yards, now then the tables flip, because then at that point, yeah, you can probably pelt enough shells downrange fast enough, both in terms of rate of fire and in terms of flight time, to just smother a battleship before it can meaningfully do all that much to you in return. And maybe you could pull that off in a circumstance where the battleship has to maintain a certain position to do something, maybe defend some carriers or something, although why the carriers aren't manoeuvring at speed in the opposite direction to get away is another matter entirely. But it's very, very circumstantial, as opposed to the battleship, which in any of those engagements is still perfectly capable of laying the smack down at long range, where your own long-range 8-inch fire is probably relatively ineffective. Prusi Antica asks, generally, German World War II capital ships seem to be somewhat worse off in terms of design efficiency, capability versus weight and space, which seems to be related to the specific technological and manufacturing limitations of the German shipbuilding industry. If you instead took the very best technologies and specialities of every major navy and applied them all together to the various ship designs that ultimately weren't built, do any of these suddenly become a lot more feasible and or treaty compliant? Yeah, so there's a variety of things that you could adopt if you wanted to just do a buy our powers combined and look at various scrap designs. So one of the single biggest things that, in terms of this sort of combination technology that could be adopted, would just be the French force circulation boilers, simply because they save so much space and weight compared to an average machinery plant. They're one of the biggest advantages that the French have in ship design. I mean, look at everybody else's actually treaty-compliant ships, and you're looking at 27 to 28 knots. Richelieu manages to breeze past 30 knots while staying broadly treaty-compliant as well. Doesn't really sacrifice all that much of anything in terms of weaponry or protection, just through having a better machinery plant. So, for example, on a very mild case, the 12-gun King George V design with 3 quadruple turrets, eminently feasible if you still want to, say, do 28 knots but use a French-style force circulation power plant. You'll easily save enough weight to get those 2 guns back. Combine that with an actually sensible non-distributed armour scheme and actually having a dual-purpose secondary armament, and you could easily get Bismarcks down to 35,000 tons. If you adopt the all-forward firing of either a Nelson or Richelieu-style ship, you can cut that down perhaps even further. Of course, using a good secondary battery, whether that be the American 5-inch 38 or probably maybe the British 4.5, that's going to save you a lot of weight if you have split batteries, as well as improve your overall firepower. And there's also little subtle changes to improving ship survivability as well, taking into account if whatever ship you're choosing to modify uses that combination of dual-purpose secondaries, good quality, all-or-nothing armour scheme, and French recirculating force circulation boilers, You could also do things like, say, improve your torpedo defences in terms of strength, so they can resist stronger or more torpedo attacks. Now, put that all together for the cancelled German designs in the run-up to World War II. Well, I mean, you can easily probably pull 3,000-4,000 tons off the Hipper class, if not more, to make them, an actually vaguely efficient heavy cruiser. The H-39s, I mean, the H-39s were already buildable, but they have now become efficient and buildable. The H-41s probably now become reasonably plausible. The paper napkin sketches of things like the H-45s, nothing's really going to save them all that much because they're just ridiculous. But things like, say, the O-class battle cruisers, you might actually be able to fit some armour on them, or something along those lines. And the list goes on. So, yeah, broadly speaking, combining all those things, there's a lot of different designs that you now can build or build more easily. The single biggest problem you're going to run into, particularly if you're looking at the German cancelled designs, is just dockyard space. You don't have enough slipways to build everything. Glenn Ricafrente asks, could you tell us about the illustrious naval career of one Captain Georg von Trapp, singing optional? So a very brief summary would be that von Trapp came from a somewhat noble background. Wasn't sort of high, counts and dukes and stuff like that, but, still fairly well regarded, but also a military family. His father had been a military officer, and so in the mid-1890s he joined the military, specifically the Austro-Hungarian Navy. And it didn't actually take him that long to see action, because within half a decade he was aboard an Austro-Hungarian cruiser that was present during the Boxer Rebellion in China, and that cruiser, and therefore its crew, were involved in a number of the more significant actions during that conflict. And a lot of his military career seems to move in half-decade periods approximately, because by the middle of the 1900s he'd heard of this newly invented thing called the submarine, and began to think about maybe transferring to said submarine arm. And another 5 years later, in 1910, not only had he succeeded in transferring over to the submarine arm of the Austro-Hungarian Navy, but in that year he was also given command of a brand new submarine, the U-6. And then move forward another half-decade to 1915, and he's now in command of the U-5, which is the class lead, of which U-6 obviously was a part of that class, and he starts active combat patrols. The initial part of his wartime career was spent targeting warships, so he managed to sink a large French armoured cruiser and, interestingly enough, another submarine from the Italian Navy. But as Allied anti-submarine techniques improved and they moved the majority of their warships to the southern end of the Adriatic, warship pickings were fairly slim, and the U-5 class was pretty small, only a little bit over 200 tons, so they weren't exactly going to go the full length of the Adriatic for any kind of long-distance patrols. However, he was reassigned to another submarine, the U-14, which was actually a salvaged French submarine, and it's quite funny because it's often described as significantly larger than his previous command. And indeed, yes, it displaced almost twice as much as his previous command. But as we've just established, his previous command wasn't exactly very large. So U-14 displaced somewhat over 400 tons, which, yeah, okay, it's a bit bigger, but it's still not a massive submarine. We're still talking something that would be viewed in most of World War I as a coastal vessel. Nonetheless, he took that on to significant success, sinking 11 Allied merchant ships while he was in command of that vessel. But of course, in the aftermath of World War I, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was broken up, and Austria, and well, Hungary for that matter as well, were left without coastlines, which meant that von Trapp obviously now didn't have a naval career because, well, there wasn't a navy anymore. And, of course, later on, through various shenanigans, would go on to be the direct inspiration for the film The Sound of Music, but obviously that is post-dating his naval career. And just for reference, he married, actually, interestingly enough, the granddaughter of Robert Whitehead, the inventor of the torpedo, which is somewhat appropriate for someone who would go on to use torpedoes in his naval career. But obviously after she died, that's when, in the interwar period, that's when you get Maria showing up and training in music, although obviously The Sound of Music compresses the events of approximately a decade into a few months. nonetheless, that's where all of that comes from, and they do end up eventually moving over to America. Scott Jennings asks, why exactly were cruisers so important to the European colonial powers from the turn of the century to the interwar period? What sort of missions would these ships take on in colonial waters? Would a cruiser undertake such a mission alone, or would cruisers on colonial duties operate in groups and or be escorted by smaller vessels? Cruisers were very important to European powers, particularly because they're essentially the Swiss Army knife of the early 20th century navies. Now, for the Japanese and US navies, cruisers fulfilled actually a relatively limited set of roles, essentially scouting for the fleet, screening the fleet against enemy scouting, and perhaps escorting some other elements of the fleet, like the carriers, simply due to their speed. But essentially, the vast majority of cruiser roles in the Pacific, for the two Pacific-based navies, were centered directly around the fleet. Now, of course, those roles, scouting for the fleet, escorting the fleet, etc., were roles that cruisers in European navies did also have to fulfill, but they had this whole extra colonial aspect, and the list of things they were expected to do was massively long. So, for example, the reason, by the way, that you would use a cruiser instead of a battleship or a destroyer is that a battleship is a relatively rare thing, even for a big navy, and needs to be deployed on a long-term basis to areas of significant strategic interest where similar opposition may be expected. So, guarding home waters, guarding particularly key critical areas like, say, the Mediterranean. You can't just send them all over the place all the time. However, a destroyer, which is very cheap and theoretically could be in lots of places all the time, is also, relatively speaking, short range, a low endurance platform, and relatively unprotected with a relatively limited carrying capacity. Whereas a cruiser can go very long distances at very high speeds. It can sustain those speeds. They usually have a modicum of armor, which means that the relatively minor amounts of firepower that colonial rebellions can usually pick up isn't really a threat to them. And obviously, compared to a destroyer, they carry significantly greater firepower, which makes them much more impressive and threatening in the first place, along with their size, but also means that if they do have to help putting something down, they can put it down a lot more effectively. As you can see with the Leander here, by the interwar period, they're also carrying aircraft. And with their much greater carrying capacity, they can carry meaningful naval brigades for going ashore, or in a pinch, act as impromptu troop transports, because again, they have the volume to do so. So cruisers would do any number of things. They would do diplomatic functions, they would show the flag, and again, they're big enough and impressive enough to do that. They're generally operating on their own, unless they're part of a cruiser squadron that is specifically looking at an anti-commerce raider role, or for smaller navies, perhaps looking for a commerce raider role. But those formations, while they exist notionally, would only tend to routinely operate multiple ships together, either in major showing the flag exercises or when hostilities and tensions were getting quite high. In day-to-day peacetime operations, you might have, say, a cruiser squadron assigned to Hong Kong, and you might see multiple cruisers in Hong Kong harbour at any one point, but when they deploy, it will generally be individually. And as well as these duties, they'd also do things like anti-piracy, diplomacy between various European powers, as well as obviously with the locals. And assuming that the navy in question isn't directly involved in a war, in which case obviously full wartime activity, but if, say, someone else nearby is at war, then they would be conducting commerce protection for their own commerce, so convoy escorting, that kind of thing. And at least in the First World War and the period when tactics were surrounding either pre-World War I or World War I scale tactics, cruisers would also be expected to hunt down and destroy their opposite numbers to stop them doing commerce raiding activities. Obviously, by the Second World War, the use of cruisers as commerce raiders, while it did occasionally happen, especially in the Atlantic, was significantly rarer simply because, unlike the First World War, thanks to the various caps in the interwar period, thanks to the naval treaties, there just weren't that many cruisers, and so the need for their use in fleet duties meant very few, if any, were ever really available for commerce raiding, and hence you see the rise proportionally speaking, of considerably more commerce raiders made from converted merchant vessels. And of course, unless you get very specific circumstances like Cormoran versus Sydney, a cruiser is also the ideal counter to an armed merchant raider. Sapper Ninja asks, if you could pick, say, 5 moments in naval history where you could be a fly on the wall, which would you pick? With a caveat that no matter the circumstances, your safety is not at risk. You are simply an observer. Personally, I've long been fascinated with the moment when Shear sees the horizon explode and realises that the trap that he has unknowingly steamed into. So if we're talking specific moments like that rather than battles as a whole, then yeah, I'd agree. Jutland offers all sorts of opportunities, but that would certainly be one of them. I think given that I've only got 5, I would have to say Jutland has only one of those slots, but if it wasn't going to be that particular slot, the other slot would probably be the arrival of 5th Battle Squadron, just to see how all of that played out. Of course, you've got Trafalgar. That would be another definite pick for me, although I wouldn't go for when Nelson was shot. What I would actually like to watch would be Victory breaking the line, because I think that, subject of many paintings and much discussion, but that would be a really cool thing to watch. Also, the initial clash of the fleets at the Battle of Lepanto. That's definitely on the list of things to have a look at. Some point in the Battle of Granville or Gravelines, or however the heck it's pronounced, basically the final actual military confrontation during the Spanish Armada. And then the last moment, that's a little bit of a multi-way tie. I'd be tempted to go for possibly the Battle of Tsushima, as Togo completes his loop around to fully engage the 2nd Pacific Squadron, or possibly the Battle of Samar, if for no other reason than to actually see what Yamato's actually like when she's actively fighting, and also to get a spot on Taffy 3, which would be quite nice. Or the wild card, which would be to go and witness the Battle of Actium, if for no other reason than to actually have a definitive account of what on earth was going on, as opposed to the multiple contradictory accounts we have these days. William asks, I have the impression from N.A.M. Rogers' latest book that the distinction between engineering and line officers in the late 19th century and early 20th centuries may have been significantly greater in the Royal Navy than the US Navy, perhaps because of the effect of the shared Annapolis education. Is this true, and what was the situation in other contemporary navies? So yes, there was a very significant divide between engineering and line officers in the Royal Navy, and the situation in various navies varied quite considerably. The US Navy was sort of at perhaps one end of the spectrum, and the Royal Navy perhaps at the other, and at most everyone else somewhere in between. The fundamental reason for this is how navies approached their officers, and also obviously historical baggage to a certain degree as well. Now, I've noted before in various dry docks that the general approach that the Royal Navy takes with its officers, at least on those who might consider to be on the command track, is that an officer is there to know how to lead men. Now, as part of that, an officer may choose to become a specialist in some aspect of the technologies that make up a warship. So you'll see some officers who are very good torpedo officers, some officers who are really good gunnery officers, and of course, during your initial career, before you become a commander or a captain in charge of a major ship, or perhaps a lieutenant or lieutenant in charge of a smaller vessel, you will end up in charge of sections of a ship. Perhaps if you're, a lieutenant on a battleship, you might be in charge of a torpedo section or something like that, and obviously you would then have to learn how that operates. But as I say, broadly, the Royal Navy is interested in its commanding officers knowing how to lead men and knowing tactics and strategy, which obviously helps you to lead everybody, hopefully, to victory. They're not so interested specifically in you must have X amount of technical knowledge in order to be the commander of a vessel or the leader of a fleet. And that meant that when engineering officers first arose in the middle of the 19th century, they were seen as kind of a separate discipline entirely. There was a certain amount of prejudice involved because, hey, at that point you're in the middle of Pax Britannica, so officers can be very nice and clean and posh and on the upper decks and everything, whereas engineers are, filthy, dirty people who live down in the bilges, tending to these weird things that go clank and bang but somehow make the ship move. And while an officer in charge of, say, a 1840s, 1850s ship of the line with an auxiliary steam engine doesn't actually really have to know all that much about how, say, the ship's guns operate. Obviously, you do get, again, as I said, Royal Navy captains that are expert gunners, but that's why you have the master gunners there. If you order a full broadside, you're ordering a full broadside at that ship. It's down to the expert gunners on the ship to actually turn that into reality. Whereas if you're the engineer down in the hold, not only have you got charge of a much smaller number of people compared to all the gunners and sailors, but half the time you're the one telling everyone else how to fix everything, and quite often also getting your hands dirty literally fixing things. So it leads to two very, very different approaches to things, and as a result you end up with almost two completely separate branches of officers, to the point that for a chunk of time in the Victorian Navy it's pretty much impossible for an engineer officer or an engineering officer to become an officer who will then take command of anything really substantial. Which, weirdly enough, given that it's an American TV show, is sort of reflected in Star Trek, certainly the original series Next Generation, where you obviously have all the different coloured uniforms, and using Next Generation as an example, you have the red uniform, which are the people on the command track, and you have the yellow uniform, which for some bizarre reason is both engineering and security, but never mind. But that kind of designation, if they could have done it with such bright colours, would certainly have been something that would have appealed to the 19th century Royal Navy. And it's only really as the century turns from the 19th to the 20th that you start to see some people pushing for a more unified approach where every officer is an officer who can, in theory, take command of a ship at some point in their later career, and also happens to have a specialisation. Fisher being actually one of the primary advocates of this through the Fisher-Selborne scheme. Whereas the US Navy seems to take that more general all-rounder approach of, hey, you're a technical expert in this, that, or the other, possibly multiple this, that's, or the others, and you have a commission as an officer, and therefore at some point you're expected to be able to take command of a ship as well. And that kind of a more generalist approach rather than the specific leadership approach is typical of the US Navy for the same kind of time period. And as far as I'm given to understand, the general divide, although obviously the engineering versus everybody else has been mostly healed in the Royal Navy, but the kind of leadership focus versus general technical focus is still one of the key differences between Royal Navy and US Navy officers even to this day. Matt Blom asks, I recently won the Archangelisk, aka ex-Royal Sovereign, in World of Warships, which prompted me to look up the ship, and I was reminded how the Soviets returned it with the main guns jammed on the centerline due to lack of rotation or maintenance. I was wondering if you have any information on turret maintenance details for the Revenge-class battleship, such as how often the turrets were supposed to be rotated, lubricated, or otherwise maintained. I don't have specific information for the Revenge-class battleships in particular, as in, every 4 weeks you must do this much rotation of turrets, etc. But more generally within the Royal Navy, and, well, indeed any other navy that has a battleship like Royal Sovereign, there are multiple things you need to do. Firstly, obviously, you need to keep everything lubricated because that helps things turn, and you have to use the right kind of lubrication. Now, there are some indications that perhaps the lubricants that were aboard Royal Sovereign, particularly in relatively speaking, exposed areas like the gun turrets and barbettes, weren't necessarily the best for Arctic operations, because an awful lot of general lubricants that are used in most of the world, if you expose them to Arctic conditions, either start to gum up or actually freeze solid. You need very specific lubricants that can work at very low temperatures. However, the Russians obviously operated some capital units of their own, the Ganguts, in their various refit forms by the end of World War II, plus, of course, they had other largish vessels. So even if Royal Sovereign had gone up there with inadequate lubricants, it wasn't beyond the powers of the Russian Navy to supply it with the proper ones. And in terms of actually rotating the turrets, this needs to be done on a reasonably regular basis, not only just to check that everything's working, but also to help distribute the lubricant, because, of course, if the turret's on its roller bearings, you can't actually lubricate the bit of the bearing that's in contact with the turret ring for obvious reasons. So you lubricate everything around it, turret gets rotated, the lubricant gets dragged around, and also then the next time you lubricate it, you can lubricate the dry spots, assuming obviously that the turret's in a slightly different location at the time, which hopefully it will be. And it's not just about making sure that the lubricants stay in place, because the lubricants don't just help you rotate, they also act as something of a seal, because you can't paint these areas, so the grease and lubricants, etc., they also help keep the thing from rusting. Also, continuous movement helps rust from helps prevent rust from building up, because of course the weight of several hundred, possibly over 1,000 tons of metal grinding around on the bearings will of course grind off any rough spots like rust. You have another problem on top of that, which is that, and anyone who's worked with truly heavy machinery will be familiar with this, if you leave bits of heavy machinery that have things like bearings and motors and track runs, etc., in one place for too long, you can end up with one of two problems arising, or possibly both. One of which, at the more extreme end, would be compression welding or cold welding, which is essentially the forces forcing these two things together, if left static for a prolonged period of time, will actually fully or partially join the two things together simply through sheer continuous exerted force, i.e. pressure. Or at the lower end of things, deformation, i.e. plastic deformation that is irrevocable. Because, again, if everything is absolutely static and you're putting a huge amount of pressure on it constantly all the time, nothing is truly invincible, and if you just keep that in place all the time, you're going to end up with very slight and then progressively greater deformations in the load-bearing structures. And for something like the bearings on a ship, if you've deformed them through simply having the weight sit static on them for ages and ages and ages and ages, the deformation might only be slight, but you've got to overcome that deformation to get the thing moving at all. And then, of course, it's not going to move particularly well after that. You might also potentially have a degree of compression welding going on, which you'd have to obviously break to get the thing moving. And any and all rust that builds up is obviously acting as a further impediment. And at some point, all of those combined is going to have an energy that's necessary to break them all that is greater than the energy that can be provided by the turret training motors, which is essentially what seems to have happened to Royal Sovereign. And if you want, admittedly, not quite a perfect example, but at least one that a lot of people will be familiar with, look at car tyres. If you have a vehicle and you park said vehicle, especially if you have to park it up on a curb or any kind of angle, you'll know that the bottom of the tyre is slightly bulged under the weight of the car coming down on top of it. Of course, you continuously run the vehicle, and you're not going to park the vehicle consistently at a point where exactly the same point of the tyre is downwards, and the rubber is quite elastic anyway. And so the fact that if you park the car overnight or for a few weeks, the part of the tyre in contact with the road is being slightly deformed, somewhat greater than in a slightly different way than the other portions of the tyre, is not a huge problem, because it kind of evens out and recovers over time. But if you leave a car static for months or years, even if you keep the tyre pressure up, the rubber will eventually start to permanently deform to the point that when you try and move it, the tyre just will not take its original shape. You'll just end up with a flattened portion of the tyre. And this is something that a lot of, for example, aircraft museums have to deal with as a significant issue. Because, of course, if you put the landing gear out and have an aircraft sitting static for the first year, fine. For the second year, fine. Obviously, if you let the tyres deflate, that's another problem entirely. But if a aircraft's been sitting in exactly the same place and its tyres have never been moved for 10, 15, 20 years, even if, again, if you've kept the pressure up, you go and see that aircraft, you will notice the lower portion of that tyre has essentially just pancaked out. And if you ever want to move that aircraft, you are going to have to replace that tyre completely. And that's why aircraft museums generally will either like displaying aircraft elevated in such a way that they can either have the landing gear up, or if the landing gear are down, they're still not, load bearing. Or if they are having to display an aircraft with landing gear down on the floor of the museum, they will periodically move the aircraft around, specifically to try and avoid this. And I mean, obviously that's a much lower energy example, but the same principle applies when you're talking about leaving something as heavy as a battleship turret completely static for years and years and years at a time. Of course, not every single part of Royal Sovereign was completely trashed, because the turret training mechanisms were then used in the Jodrell Bank radio telescopes, but an awful lot of it was, with reports from the people who had to break up the ship afterwards when it was handed back in such an awful condition, running consistently along the lines of, in fact, actually, and there's even some documentary evidence, i.e. people actually wrote this down as well as just the people who were there saying so, that when they were having to clear out the ship, normally, of course, you'd have your work overalls and you'd work in those for a while and they'd get cleaned. And in really bad conditions, you'd have your work overalls and you'd have them cleaned at the end of the day, and you'd maybe have 2 or 3 pairs that would be rotated through. Now, on Royal Sovereign, it was so bad that after its return from the Soviets, that the crews were being told, okay, here are your work overalls. You go in, you work on the ship during the day, you come back, we take those work overalls from you, we're going to burn them, and we'll give you brand new ones the next day. And, if people think, oh, well, that's just the Royal Navy being overblown, look at what the US Navy encountered when they got the Murmansk ex-Milwaukee back. It was pretty much the same thing. Turns out the Russians really don't take good care of ships that they borrow from you. Lofferton Henderson asks, on this channel and elsewhere, I've heard that performance-wise, a 7.5-inch gun is closer to being a big 6-inch than a small 8-inch, and similarly, a 9.2-inch is closer to a big 8-inch than anything of 10 inches or above. In either case, you get diminishing returns above 7.5 inches for a light cruiser-type gun with a high rate of fire, and above 9.2 inches for a heavy cruiser-type gun with a good balance of shell weight and rate of fire. Can you briefly give your thoughts on an interwar world without naval treaties, or in which the treaties cap cruiser guns at 9.2 inch and allow larger displacements? Might we see light cruisers armed with 7.5 inch twins and triples rather than 6 inch, and really heavy cruisers armed with 9.2 inch twins and triples rather than 8 inch? And how much larger and heavier do you expect these ships to be compared to their 6 inch or 8 inch armed historical peers? So, assuming that displacement is either unlimited or much higher, like say 20,000 tons or something, and the biggest gun that you can fit is a 9.2 or similar, I actually think you might see 3 kinds of cruiser evolving. And that would be predicated essentially at maximal rate of useful fire, heaviest decent rate of fire, and heaviest period. Now, initially, I suspect that you might end up with everybody just going for 9.2 inch ships, pretty much the same that everyone went for 8 inch ships in the 1920s. But assuming that either the first treaty in this revised option or later treaties has something like the London Treaty, where it says, okay, you can only have this many with the biggest guns, then yeah, I think going for a 9.2 inch or similar caliber over 8 inch would make a huge amount of sense. The 9.2 inch gun weighs roughly 60% more than the 8 inch gun, and actually, interestingly, correspondingly fires a shell that's 50 to 60% heavier than the 8 inch gun. And with either the 8 inch or the 9.2 inch, you're looking at shells that are far beyond interwar period rapid fire techniques. But if you look at the best performing 9.2 inch and similar caliber guns versus at least the average 8 inch gun, the rate of fire isn't too dissimilar. So if you've got the extra weight, you're probably, once you take into account the weight of the guns, the weight of the turrets, the weight of the hoist, the weight of the ammunition, and presumably also the weight of the extra armour to at least give you a modicum of protection against your own guns, you're probably looking at a ship in the region of 14 to 15,000 tons with 8 or 9 9.2 inch guns. That will probably be a kind of baseline minimum. Although, of course, you could get larger, if someone wants to put 12 such guns on, or have, really serious armor, or just wants to build something with a bit of headroom in it. But down at the lower end, the reason I made those other two distinctions is that if you look at a 7.5-inch gun, that has a round that's about twice the weight of a 6-inch gun, so it's going to be somewhat harder to maneuver, and shell weight wise is closer to actually an 8-inch shell than a 6-inch shell. But as you kind of surmised, the actual firepower of a 7.5-inch shell is significantly less than an 8-inch for various reasons, which is beyond the scope of a Drydock question response. But I suspect that you'd probably get something in the region of a 7 to 7.5-inch gun as the largest to which 6-inch style rapid fire weaponry principles could be applied. And therefore that would be the kind of the second tier of cruiser. So its firepower would probably be selected for a number of reasons. It would be a firepower that could at least threaten the bigger 9.2-inch or similar cruisers, assuming that they are built with somewhat scanty armor, which we know that a lot of 8-inch ships, for example, in the Washington Treaty were. So if people tried to skimp out on the armor, these would kind of keep them honest a little bit, force them to uprate their protection. And also, obviously, a 7 to 7.5-inch shell would be devastating against a ship that isn't particularly well protected, especially smaller vessels. So somewhere in that region, I think you'd be approaching the maximum for interwar period rapid fire guns. But then the flip side is down at roughly a 5.5-inch caliber, so a little bit less than a 6-inch, you'd probably start to see a bunch of small trade protection cruisers going around with those guns, because the jump in rate of fire between a 5.5, 5.25, 5.6, whatever, compared to a 6-inch is actually quite considerable. For the interwar period, you're looking at roughly doubling your rate of fire with only about a 20% reduction in the weight of shell. And that's simply because, broadly speaking, 6-inch shells are around about 100 pounds, maybe a little bit more, depending on the Navy, whereas a 5.25, 5.5, 5.6, 5.4-inch, various calibers experimented with different navies, they hover around 80 pounds. And, well, anybody who's handled heavy weights will tell you that despite the mere 20 or so pound difference in weight, it's much easier for one or two people to manhandle 80-pound weights than 100, 110-pound weights, especially if you're having to do it in a rapid manner. And so relative to a 7.5-inch armed ship, you can send a lot of rounds downrange. The gun weight is obviously a lot less, and so these would make ideal general-purpose commerce protection cruisers, and they also, again, exert a similar-ish pressure as the 7.5-inch, let's say, would exert on the 9.2-inch, in that they've still got a reasonable amount of hitting power, which would mean that you would have to devote a certain amount of armor to your 7.5-inch armed ships to protect them against these smaller vessels, and those smaller vessels with a high rate of fire and a reasonable shell would still be very effective against both each other and smaller ships like destroyers. So I think you might actually end up with, at least for larger navies that have a lot of different commitments, you might end up with 3 different types of cruiser. For the Royal Navy, for example, I can see them perhaps doing the 9.2-inch ships as foreign station flagships and keeping up with the top-end cruisers of everybody else, and probably defaulting down to the 5.5-inch or similar for their general-purpose Arethusa Leander style vessels. But then, as other nations that don't have the same level of colonial commitments perhaps go for 9.2-inch and 7-point-something-inch vessels, then they're also forced to have some of that intermediate tier of cruiser as well. ACC asks, during World War I, the Brits and the Germans famously or infamously traded optics glass for rubber to allow each side's war effort to continue. Were any optics used for naval rangefinders, and do we know if they were installed in any ships before the end of the war? Now, this is a somewhat disputed thing in that, well, it is known that the trade was proposed, and a number of historians say that yes, it did happen, at least to a limited degree, but a few others say that it actually didn't, despite the arrangements being made, and that's simply because the proposal was made in 1915, but by 1916, then the British had actually essentially crash-started an optical glass industry of their own. So you can see why the argument's being made, because by late 1915, which is when such trades would have had to be made, either it would be a very limited trade until the British got their own optical glass industry up to spec, at which point they didn't need to trade anymore, or possibly everything was in place, but then someone went, well, hang on a minute, in a few months we'll have our own system in place. Do we really need to give the Germans all this rubber? But in any case, what is known for definite about the whole escapade is that the vast bulk of what was proposed to be trade were completed binocular and sets and similar, small rangefinder sets for infantry use. Because while Britain did import a good chunk of its optical glass and so forth from Germany before the war, it did have a small industry that could produce its own, which obviously was then the thing that was being crash expanded. But obviously, when you've got hundreds of thousands, millions of men on the front lines, you need an awful lot of binoculars and small rangefinders, and that's where most of the shortages were. While you need significantly larger and very, very precise lenses for optical rangefinders for battleships and so forth, those things, while obviously slightly more difficult to manufacture, are massively lower in number than what you need for the front lines. So, as far as I'm aware, there wasn't any particular mention of trading large-scale naval rangefinders or lenses, therefore, in that particular agreement, and there was enough capacity in the native British optical glass industry to supply the people like Barr and Stroud with the necessary glass to create the necessary lenses and prisms to make naval rangefinders. So as far as I'm aware, whether or not this particular trade happened at all, or whether it was just something that was negotiated and then abandoned, at no point does there seem to have been any significant talk about naval rangefinders and other similar things, and therefore, obviously, none would therefore be installed on Royal Navy ships. It seems to have been almost entirely about smaller scale infantry equipment. Farender Ritter asks, when the present United States were loyal colonies, was there an appreciable number of Royal Navy officers that came from the colonies or from colonial families? And how did their British colleagues regard them in general? Were there any standout individuals or examples? There was certainly a decent number of men serving both as regular crew and as officers in the Royal Navy who either directly themselves came from the 13 colonies or whose families had. Now, appreciable is a debatable thing simply because the population difference between Britain and the 13 colonies was quite considerable at the time. So, obviously they're not going to be 40, 50% of the Royal Navy, albeit from the facts and figures I looked at, there was a slightly disproportionate number of them, probably explained by the fact that obviously, especially before the American War for Independence and also for a certain degree thereafter, the 13 colonies, later to be the founding states of the United States of America, were very heavily maritime based, to a proportion perhaps even greater than the UK itself. And therefore, obviously, proportionally speaking, given that almost all of the US population was in coastal towns and cities, they would have a good number of sailors. And, well, if sailors want prospects, then one of those things was to join the Royal Navy. And so if you want notable officers, there are, again, a reasonable number to look at. One of them, which I'm going to highlight for the purposes of this question, was Ralph Willett Miller. He was born in 1762 in New York City, and he and his family were obviously loyalists and therefore lost everything when the American War of Independence broke out. And for that reason, both him and everybody else in question were generally regarded pretty much the same as all other British citizens in the service of the Royal Navy, because while they were subjects of the British Crown, they spoke English, And if anything, given that they'd sacrificed literally everything else they owned to maintain their loyalty to the crown, they were just as trusted, if not more so, than the regular British officers. And the reason I picked Miller is because he has actually a fairly remarkable career. He's got a pretty notable career as an officer before he attains command, but just looking at a very brief highlight of his command history is quite notable. So he's in charge of a 3-decker at the Siege of Toulon and is heavily responsible for destroying what elements of the French fleet the Allies can't take with them when they are forced to withdraw from there. He's also then briefly captain of HMS Victory, a distinction which obviously relatively few people actually get to hold. He is then, believe it or not, actually Nelson's flag captain aboard the confusingly named HMS Captain. So you've got Commodore Nelson, Captain Miller on HMS Captain at the Battle of Cape St. Vincent, the battle that really cements Nelson's reputation. Miller is there. He's in charge. He then is moved to a number of different ships, but he's in command of HMS Vanguard at the Battle of the Nile, so he's serving with Nelson again and is wounded. But while I'm sure he would have been at Trafalgar if at all he possibly could, unfortunately, shortly thereafter, while he's actually back in command of HMS Theseus, having commanded her before, and supporting British operations against the French in the Middle East, they're preparing a whole ton of different shells, howitzer shells and other explosive shells for use in shore bombardment. And something, it's not entirely known what, but something happens and all of those just explode all of a sudden, very badly damaging Theseus and setting her on fire. The only reason she's not completely destroyed is because the explosion takes place on the upper deck where they're assembling all the ammunition, but one of the casualties is Captain Miller. So he, at that point, obviously, his naval career comes to an end in 1799. But as I said, I'm sure that if he had survived that, or the explosion hadn't happened, 99% certain he would also have been at Trafalgar. And that brings us to an end to part 1 of the Drydock for this month. Thank you very much for listening, and a big shout out to everybody who came out to say hi at the various places that I recently visited over in San Francisco and the wider Bay Area. And, everybody else, and, everyone, I guess, no real restriction. Let's move on to part 2.